I'm going to give everyone another minute to sign on, so we'll begin at 12:03. Hi, everyone. It's now 12:03. I think we should go ahead and get started. We have almost everyone from the working group on, waiting for a couple more who I think will join us in the next few minutes. Emma, will you go ahead and switch to the PowerPoint? Thanks, Emma. If we could go to the next slide. Just a reminder of the meeting procedures. We ask that everyone remain on mute unless you are speaking. Working group members, you are encouraged to use video so that we can all see each other. And we're looking forward to dialogue throughout the meeting. Our best practice that we've been following is using the chat function to either add yourself to the stack or to indicate that you would like to be called on. Next slide, please. And before we get into roll call, I see Commissioner Sagos is with us. Commissioner, would you like to say a few opening remarks?
Sure. Thanks, Rosa. Hi, everyone. Hope you all are doing well and are safe. Just a few quick opening remarks. Yesterday, we had our Climate Action Council, our latest Climate Action Council meeting, Climate Justice Working Group, and the issue of disadvantaged communities investments came up over and over. As did the existence of this meeting today. So actually, you will be, as I think you know, hearing from some of these advisory panels today. I want to acknowledge them. They are going to take part: ag and forestry, energy efficiency and housing, power gen, energy intensive, trade exposed, and the just transition working group. So they're early in their process, but they are obviously beginning to think about this really important issue that you've been wrestling with. They've all been directed to include equity strategies in their work. And I know that the discussion today is important in both framing how they're thinking about to proceed toward the draft scoping plan. And I think they also have perhaps some direction, some questions for you also. I hope you have a robust discussion today. Thank you all for taking, again, more time out of your busy schedules to do this really important work for us, but we're here for you. And I'll turn it back over to you, Rosa. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. And I'll start our roll call. I'll just call your name, and if you can verbally respond, it'll also be a dual mic check for all the working group members. My name is Rosa Mendez. I'm the Director for DEC's Environmental Justice Office. And next we have Abigail.
Present.
Great. Rava?
Here.
Eddie?
Yo.
Hey. Elizabeth?
Presente.
I know Jonathan could not join us today. Amy?
I'm here.
Jared?
Present.
Sonal?
Here.
Okay, and do we have Neil?
Yep, I'm here. Good afternoon.
And Chris?
Hey, good afternoon. I'm here.
And Joe. Don't hear Joe, but we'll see if he joins us a little later. Okay, great. Let's move on to our agenda. Today we're going to go over, and for moving on for our meetings, we discussed last time that we want to build in a little more structure. So we're going to go over some business items first and then get into our discussion. One of the things that was brought to our attention that the working group members would like to discuss are the benefits considerations and also discussion on geography, the issue of place-based versus individual criteria. And then we'll go into a discussion of our draft indicator evaluation rubric, which we saw a preview of last time, and the draft list of indicators that we put together as a group. And then we have the advisory panels joining us around 1:30. And last time we had a great conversation with them, and today we're going to try to build in a little more time structure because there's more of them today. So we have the just transition, the energy efficiency and housing, agriculture and forestry, power generation, and energy intensive and trade exposed panels with us today. Next slide, please. So first for our business items, first I wanted to have some reflection on the meeting we had on December 2nd, where we did have that engagement with the transportation and land use and local government advisory panels. Each of those panels gave us a quick overview of the scope that they're working on and the considerations before them. And then we had a robust back and forth between those panel representatives and the working group members. Some of the topics that were discussed included the transportation panel to consider co-pollutants and potential disproportionate impacts on disadvantaged communities from cap and trade programs. There was a suggestion for both panels to identify and convene experts from environmental justice areas for future discussions, or if they're hosting other expert roundtables. The working group should have received a list of experts that the transportation panel had already put together. And just a reminder that if you have any suggestions, to please send them to me or to Jared Snyder. There was also discussion with the land use panel on the possibility of inventorying of land and zoning information, and to consider how to use industrial area infrastructure to revitalize the economy and increase resiliency, with putting the interests of the community as a priority. After the panel's engagement, we went through a guiding definition exercise where we are using the legislation language as a guide, but some other guiding definition thoughts captured included spatial distance for access to amenities, communities with a history of disinvestment, and looking at those impacted by systemic and historical racism. We then had a quick preview of the draft indicator evaluation rubric, which we will be further discussing today. And I'll ask now if any working group members wants to add any other reflections from that December 2nd meeting. Okay.
Looks like Eddie has a question.
Okay, Eddie.
Hi, good afternoon, all. I'm not sure. I don't think you mentioned it, Rosa, but one of the requests that came up at the actually the last couple of meetings, I heard you mention having EJ experts to come and speak to not just presumably our working group, but hopefully the other working groups. But there was a specific request for this working group that we invite two representatives from California's EnviroScreen experience, one person from government and one person from the advocacy community. Specifically, a name that was shared with us is Deputy Secretary for Environmental Justice for California EPA. Her name is Yana Garcia. will be, and I believe that she was active in the creation of their EnviroScreen. And I'm not sure, maybe Elizabeth might be able to have some recommendations from the advocacy sector.
Sure.
But yeah.
If I can interject, yeah, there are folks that were really involved in that screen. Diane Tavorkian from Environmental Health Coalition. She's the executive director in San Diego. The other is Malta Arguello, who is with Physicians for Social Responsibility. I'll put them in the chat so that you can include them in the notes.
Great. Great, thank you. And thank you for that reminder, Eddie. And we are working to set up to have those expert conversations with this working group as well. Any other reflections from working group members? Okay, great. And then moving on, we discussed also at that last meeting having a process where we can review the minutes and then approve those minutes at the next meeting. So working group members received the draft minutes along with other materials for today. I have not received any edits or comments so far. Does anyone from the working group want to open discussion on the draft minutes?
Seems straightforward.
Okay, not hearing any. We also talked about using the polling function as a way to capture our agreement on things. So we can try that out today on voting on the minutes to approve the minutes. And the way it's going to look is it'll show up on the side panel where the chat function is. And you'll have two options for response, yes or no. Let's see, is everyone seeing that poll?
Yes.
Great, so if you can indicate whether you will approve the minutes in that poll, and this will also be an easy way to save the vote for posterity. Great, I'm seeing 8 yeses and no nos. The minutes are approved for next time, so we'll move those to draft form and they will be posted on the website as well. Thanks, everyone. Emma, if you can move to the next slide, please. Next, we wanted to do a check-in on our work plan. And you'll see up on the slide here, I just did a snippet from the work plan that you all have in our shared SharePoint. And you'll see that today is our second December meeting, and we anticipated that we would have one if it was needed. I also suggested, just given where we are, that we have 2 meetings in January and 2 meetings in February. Are there any thoughts on that suggestion? Okay, great. So you all have, oh, go ahead. I heard someone.
Yeah, this is Jared Rosa. If we could limit them to, I think, the allocated 2 hours, that would be nice.
Great, thanks. I think, we've noticed today is 3 hours. Obviously, I asked you for an extra hour, and thank you so much for your flexibility with that. That was because we were having the panels coming. I think 2 hours, if we can really focus our time and energy, might work. But I know that the poll I sent out for January did include 3-hour time blocks. So if that's something we can work with, if there's consensus that you want a 2-hour meeting, I'd like to hear other working group members weigh in on that.
Hey, Rosa, this is Chris Cole. The other thing maybe worth touching on here is, I think I know we've talked about maybe looking at the possibility of setting up, kind of some workshops to kind of do deeper dives, in certain work streams, just given the fact that, if we're limited to 2 meetings a month and only a couple of hours, that doesn't provide us with a whole lot of time to, kind of work through some of the more, complex issues. So I guess I'm wondering how should we think about, finding additional time? And I guess related to the question of meeting with California, where would we want to include that in the work plan as well? I mean, would that be something that folks want to do as part of a standing working group meeting, or would that be kind of a separate meeting? So maybe we can have a
great question,
discussion of what
Chris.
preferences are there.
Yeah, any preferences from working group members? The idea of having additional workshops so that our business sessions can fit into a 2-hour block, particularly if we arrange a session with the California experts. I think I see Eddie hand raised.
Yeah, given the kind of nature of what we're trying to do as this working group, I think it would be in our mutual benefit to have that presentation from our California allies at one of our open meetings as opposed to a side smaller meeting. I think there's benefit to hearing from them, not just for us, but for anyone else who's tuning in to these conversations. And as to whether we want to have longer big meetings or a series of smaller offline meetings, I don't have a strong preference either way. I'm nervous about the time sensitivity of our work and how much we have to do and the limited time we have. So I'm curious about what my co-panelists think about that. Ambivalent is probably the best way to describe it.
Thanks, Eddie. That's kind of the urgency that I was considering when I suggested 3-hour meetings in the January doodle poll you received, but would love to hear from other working group panel members.
This is Amy. I hate to be the sort of negative Nancy in the house, but 3 hours is just really hard in a day. That's just a really large block of time for me. And I feel guilty if I have to, pop off and not stay the whole time. And so, I wasn't able to come to the last meeting because I just, I want to fully participate, but I feel like if they were 3-hour blocks, I don't know that I could really participate in an ongoing way. So I'd be concerned about that.
Thank you, Amy. Any other working group members want to weigh in?
I share the sense of urgency and recognize that we have a lot of work that needs to get done. If we do have 3-hour meetings, I guess my request would be that we have some kind of short stretch break or something in the middle, just, to keep us all healthy. And then also, in terms of scheduling and some of what Amy, mentioned, the sooner in advance we can get all of these meetings on our calendar, I think it allows just for, kind of scheduling around it. So however it works out, that would be my request, is just to know sooner rather than later.
Great, thanks, Abigail. So I think what we can do, you all already have the doodle poll for January. I will ask that you try to fill those out, and if it seems like the 3-hour block just means that it's not workable for January, we'll send another poll with 2-hour blocks. And in addition, as suggested by Abigail, we'll get the February and March polls out this week or next week to make sure that we're planning those blocks out in advance. The other thing on the work plan, you'll see that I highlighted, we had in place for January to discuss feedback for the advisory panels. Now I'm suggesting that we move that to February just to give the panels more time to solidify what they're working on so that we can be giving them some robust feedback on their efforts. Any discussion on the idea of moving that to February? Okay, I'm not seeing any. Thanks, everyone. That's our work plan check-in. And as I said earlier, we're going to do these work plan check-ins and the minutes recap at every meeting, just so that everyone gets a refresher on where we are and where we're heading. Emma, you can move to the next slide, please. Great, thank you. And I believe now I am turning it over to Illume, to Amanda and Alex, if you'd like to introduce yourselves and take over, please.
Sure, this is Alex Dunn. In light of recent things, I'm going to call myself Dr. Alex Dunn for today. Hope that gives you all a chuckle. It's definitely a PhD, not an MD. And Amanda Dwelly, my colleague, is here. We actually wanted to start the ball rolling of talking about benefits and then also the geography-based, geography versus individual or place-based versus individual criteria. But Chris actually has the next couple slides just to give a kind of a perspective on the benefits, and then we will jump in to discuss a little bit more of the meat of the place-based versus individual. So take it away, Chris.
Thanks, Doctor. Everybody. So kind of, taking a step back here, and maybe a bit of a reflection on the last meeting we had. We were talking a lot about indicators and criteria for defining, the disadvantaged communities. And I think what kept resurfacing was the interdependence of not only the criteria we're talking about for a disadvantaged community, but also, how we're thinking about benefits, how we're thinking about the investments that the state is making. So what we wanted to do, just to start the conversation this afternoon, is just kind of do a bit of a level set on kind of those other kind of work streams, and obviously make sure everybody is aware of kind of what's happening there, and give everyone a level of comfort in terms of what the next steps look like with respect to those work streams. So I think everyone's seen the specific language from the law at this point, in terms of directing state agencies and entities to consult with the Climate Action Council, the working group, to kind of direct program resources into disadvantaged communities. And these resources are kind of cover a number of different investment areas, which really kind of makes kind of the work that we have ahead of us interesting in the sense that we really need to think about kind of what investments look like and what the nature of those investments, as well as the benefits that would be attributable, what they look like across these various kind of investment areas. And I think next slide. We provide a bit of a visual for kind of like how we're thinking about the various pieces here, right? So we have the independent or interdependent work streams that I mentioned in terms of the investments, the benefits, and the criteria for a disadvantaged community. And as we're thinking about the investments, right, it's, what programs, what portfolios of state investments that would actually count in the numerator and denominator as we're thinking about the accounting of benefits to disadvantaged communities. And when we're thinking about the benefits, we're going to need to think about, for those various investment areas, what sort of benefits can be measured and tracked and ultimately roll up to that 40% goal. So, and as we're thinking about the work ahead of us and the conversations we've had to date, it's really hard to break apart the various work streams. But given the fact that the law is kind of requiring some additional process when it comes to the definition of a disadvantaged community with, with respect to, us hosting public statement hearings and then, publishing the draft criteria for public comment. We thought it would be really important to obviously start there and ensure that, as a working group, we get comfortable with, what the indicators look like and ultimately, can develop that draft criteria to meet the timelines that we had laid out in the work plan that Rosa just previewed. So if we go to the next slide, please. So, as we're thinking about the investments, as I mentioned earlier, the law is kind of outlining kind of a broad kind of array of investment areas that need to be included as we're thinking about the accounting of benefits, and those, those investment areas apply to multiple state agencies and portfolios of investment. So as we're kind of thinking about this work now, at least as the staff team, there's a couple of work streams that we've started that we want to give you all a preview on for more discussion at the working group once we get a little more progress made on the disadvantaged communities criteria, and that's kind of an investment criteria work stream. So the state team is currently kind of pulling together an inventory of the relevant investments, or at least those that we think are relevant across the various state agencies. Within each of these buckets or groups of investment. So whether it be workforce development or economic development, energy assistance, housing, so on and so forth. And in parallel, we're also working with a loom to start to flesh out a benefits framework. To really think about what are the sorts of benefits that can be attributed to these various investments. What the different considerations would be for measuring those benefits, for quantifying them, monetizing them, and then ultimately what the methodologies, methodological considerations might need to be for accounting of benefits, that might not be site specific, right? So as we're thinking about the various investments that we want to make sure we're counting here, there are those that are more directly kind of measured to a project site, and there may be others that are maybe a little more difficult to measure, that may be more dispersed in nature, that we need to develop some methodology for how we're going to measure and count those benefits, and not to leave the best for last, but then there's the challenge of how we pull together a process and a system for counting and rolling up the benefits across the various state portfolios, so we can get to the point where we're able to report out on kind of what the investments or what the investments are resulting in terms of benefits to the disadvantaged communities that we're going to be developing criteria for. So I ran through that pretty quickly, and so we want to make sure we have some time to answer any questions that you all have on kind of those work streams. But we will be looking to schedule follow-on discussions on those work streams as part of the working group once we have more work kind of fleshed out, so we have something that we can present and have you all react to. But we thought it would be important to kind of preview that work and just let you all know that we are kind of thinking through kind of those other pieces now, as we're focusing our attention as a working group on the disadvantaged communities criteria. So let me stop there, and Rosa, is there anything you would add to that quick overview?
Nothing to add. Hoping working group members, if you have any questions for us on this or any other discussion points for benefits?
I have a question, but I think Eddie is raising his hand, so you could jump over to him first, and I'll ask my question after.
Jared, please go. Actually, there's also a question in the chat, so I'll wait till after Jared and the question in the chat. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Thank you. So yeah, I'll try to articulate this best I can. It's more of a, I guess, a comment. And I know this is being developed, but I have a little concern, I guess, about the way the benefits are applied to these different buckets or work streams, whatever terminology we're using, that it's possible that if the application is inconsistent, it might not be equitably, the benefits might not be equitably distributed. And so I just want to know how the state is looking at ensuring that that does not happen, since there's some inconsistency, I guess, in the way they might be rolled out or implemented.
Jared, so we're starting with looking at the investments themselves and trying to understand what are the benefits that we would attribute or we could attribute to those investments. And then when it comes to accounting and ensuring that there's an equitable distribution of benefits, that's part of the process that we have to develop. I guess it's worth pointing out that there's probably, depending on the community, right, there may be different types of benefits that are more relevant or more important. So we need to factor that into the to the thinking as well. I'd imagine, or I'd expect that that'll be something we talk about once we have some more work done here on kind of framing out what the what this benefits work stream looks like.
Gotcha. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, it's not really a question. It's more of just an awareness level, I guess, at this point early on.
Yeah. No, thank you for raising that.
Eddie, you were up next.
Yeah, no, I was actually deferring to the question in the chat, and I can go after that.
Oh, okay, I see. Chris, the question in the chat says the umbrella diagram includes pollution reduction. Are greenhouse gas emissions considered pollution? If so, this would include a broader range of state funding programs.
Yeah, so the pollution reduction, criteria was included in the law. So, part of what we need to do in terms of developing this investment criteria that I mentioned is looking at kind of what are the types of programs and investments that would fall under the this umbrella. And so, I guess it's a question currently, how we think about GHG emissions related to pollution reduction. I mean, generally, I think that's what we would imagine that they do fall under that umbrella or that bucket. So, and then from there, we need to understand what the what the relevant programs are. I mean, I think the other thing that's worth flagging here is kind of like that top level screen is investments in clean energy and energy efficiency, right? So as you look at the law, we're looking at programs, investments, resources targeting energy efficiency and clean energy that have outcomes that fall into these different areas. So that's part of the thinking here too, is trying to make sure that we're identifying the right universe of programs and resources that are part of the calculus.
Can I jump?
Yep, go ahead, Eddie.
Okay, so I've got actually two non-benefits questions I just want to throw in the queue, and then the question related to benefits. One is, and I don't know if this has come up at all, how will the disadvantaged community definitions affect, if at all, DEC's ongoing potential EJ area framework, right? And that leads me to the second question, non-investment question, right? Which was, if we look at the Cal EJ or Enviro screen, they use that tool for more than just climate investments, right? They use it for permit hearings, they use it for, and in fact, that's what presumably that's what the potential EJ area definition did, right? Was it supposedly raised the check-in and consultation process for EJ communities, which if the disadvantaged community is only about investments, how are EJ communities going to have stricter reviews of permits, for example, and other, so if someone could just speak to that, and then I'll hold off the other two questions.
Sure, Eddie, I'll speak to that. And as usual, you have the very same questions that the state is looking at. And we know that they're, from past work that we've done with you and other environmental justice leaders, is that there's been a desire for the EJ areas to include pollution burden information, because right now they're limited to demographic. And for us, we really need to see what is included in the disadvantaged communities definition before we could consider, does that definition work for other uses? So for example, you said we use ours for an enhanced public participation associated with permitting. Very well, that might be something we could use the disadvantaged communities for. But again, we'd have to see what information is being fed into that definition before we could be certain that that's the route we want to take.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I would just urge this working group and our state partners to give some thought to that, because I can easily see confusion both from communities and private applicants and then governments, and what framework should we be using following the EJ potential areas, this disadvantaged communities thing. There's nothing in the law, as far as I could tell, that prevents the application of disadvantaged communities in other government framework or other government approval processes. And it just might make life easier and simpler and more transparent for everyone if, once we're done with this, we're also considering the non-investment applicability of these designations. Let me switch for a second to the benefits framework. I think one, I guess, is a question for Chris. I don't know if you mentioned it, but do you have a sense of when we may be able to see what the framework will look like? And the reason I'm asking that is because when you mentioned having to figure it out because you want to make sure that the investments are targeted, and there are going to be some instances where the investments are more dispersed. And I hate to harp on this, but this is exactly why when the legislation was first written, the initial drafting was to make sure that investments, the way we would track these was actual direct funding. So we would avoid this problem that we're in now of trying to figure out what's a benefit, as opposed to direct funding, which is a very clear, transparent, and frankly would have made all our lives easier, governments and ours. So I'm just wondering if as part of the benefits framework, like when you guys are expecting to share that with us, and how are you processing that when we're also going to be able to look at funding that's directly funding. So there'll be some instances where the funding is clear, and there'll be instances where they will have to apply the benefits framework. And I'm just wondering if you guys have started thinking about the tensions between those two accountability frameworks.
Yeah, we've recently started to pull together the thinking on the benefits framework. So there's still more to do, but we will kind of make sure that we're sitting down and kind of talking through this with you guys once we have something that we something of substance that we could speak to. So looking at the calendar, maybe this is something that we can take on, in maybe in the second meeting in January. I don't know. We could talk to, we'll have to talk about that with Rosa and look at the rest of the agenda items, but certainly, we'll be making progress on this over the next month or so. So we'll make sure, you guys are in the loop on those conversations.
Thanks, Chris. And the last point was the previous question that was in the chat about GHG emissions, whether they're considered pollution or not. As far as I can tell, and probably there are other areas of law that expressly states this, but the intention of the 35 to 40% applicability to disadvantaged communities was intended for it's intended for clean energy programs, right? It's intended for the kinds of investments that we're going to be embarking on as a state to reduce our carbon footprint. So for Dazzle's point, I would agree. Like it was intended for those programs as well. We should be looking at the broader range of state funding programs that includes all of the clean energy investments that the state deploys. So thanks.
Okay.
Thanks. Chris, did you want to go on to the next slide?
Sure. Is this, was this me or was this?
Hey, actually, Chris, can I butt in? Yeah. Before you do go on to this, first of all, I really appreciate you guys, bringing this. It's helping to clarify a lot of things. So thank you for taking the time on the agenda to put this in there. Two questions I had, which I think are related to what you just covered, not what you're about to cover, is where does community voice and kind of local control or, decision-making power come into this as you're currently envisioning it? And I know, Chris, you've done a lot of work just recently of really trying to make sure that, communities have a say in what investments are happening. And so, what's kind of the long-range plan for that? And on a very related note, who kind of holds the reins in terms of accountability for this over the long term? I don't know if that makes sense.
So in terms of accountability, so I'll defer to Rosa a bit on that. I mean, I think so. Given that this is the law, right? I mean, we're required to deliver these benefits, and we're going to need to be able to report out on them. Yeah, I don't know. I mean,
I suppose what I'm asking, Chris, is that interpretation of what qualifies as a benefit. Does the community, over the long term especially, but short term as well, what is the community's role in determining what benefits look like at the local level?
Yeah, so I think that's an area where we're looking at. We're going to have to look at the different types of programs and investments, right, and try to understand what are the types of benefits that would be we would expect to flow through those different types of programs or interventions. So one of the things that we're going to need to think about is, what is the nature of the investment, right? So are there certain types of investments that are being made that it's really difficult to get kind of to get input on, so or investments like, and I'll just use some of the NYSERDA investments as an example, because I'm more familiar with how we do things there. We would be, on a program specific level, kind of trying to better understand, with our community partners, what are the things that are benefits, and how do we kind of structure programs to deliver benefits to those communities. One of the tensions when it comes to benefits that we're going to, need to confront and think about is, what's measurable, what's the nature of measurement, how can we actually make sure that the benefit is going to the, to the community. And how do we kind of fit that into a system and a process so, you know, these multiple different state agencies and portfolios are able to kind of report. I think one of the challenges that, you know, we're seeing kind of right now is it can get very complicated. It can be very costly. So to Eddie's point earlier about, you know, benefits, you know, we need to think about, you know, what are the implications for kind of process systems as well as just, you know, the defining of the benefit. But, you know, we would expect to have, you know, community, you know, input on what's, you know, what is a benefit.
And just to add to that, Chris,
that might be at the program level. Yeah.
And just to add to that, Chris, I'll note that there is tracking and reporting associated with many elements of the climate legislation, including on the benefit side. And I'll point out that Eddie included in the chat that the state comptroller and the legislature plays an outside role in terms of accountability as well. And then Rawa, you're next in the stack.
Yes, thank you so much, Rosa. So I don't want this question that Abigail asked to get lost in the shuffle because it is complex, and I appreciate all the complexity and everyone holding it. But this concept of, you know, who gets to even decide who community is, I think is incredibly important. I think most of that is actually answered in many of, you know, EJ leaders that are working in frontline communities and already have ways of getting input from community. But I don't think, you know, New York State is a very large state, so everyone might not have that, but how can we include in the criteria itself community input? And there are state agencies that are already doing that. For example, you know, HCR does this whenever anyone's applying for like affordable housing or housing development projects. Any developer now has to give input as part of their, you know, grades that they get and being moved forward. And so I don't know, I just feel like it is such an important piece, and somehow we, as we are defining and coming up with criteria, should also include.
Great, thanks, Rawa. And I know we teed up in some of our earlier sessions. I know that associated with our work, there is for the draft public comment sessions and a public comment period. But I think a question that we pinned for discussion is whether you wanted, as a group, you desired having input come in before the draft from the public. So I know we put a pin in that, but I hear, you know, that's definitely something we should definitely take up soon, maybe in our January sessions as we get a little closer aligned on where we're heading.
Okay. And I guess maybe I just want some clarity. I apologize because I don't mean to take up so much space. Is that this question of community input is not a one and done. It's like part of the process itself, and it's ongoing. And so I think, yeah, okay, thank you.
Oh, but to your point, and again, going back to the legislation, there is a role with this working group to review the criteria after it's, you know, settled. And that could include going to the public again for, this is what we have, let's see how it's working on the ground, right? And let's see, I have a question from Eddie about state agency audits and if they're underway. I can say that that is something that we're tracking with the staff team on how we can do some audits, something that Chris and I are working on. And next, Amy, you're on the staff.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on what Ra was saying in terms, I mean, community input is so important, but I also, she was alluding to difference in different parts of the state. I mean, this is a very different state, you know, in terms of upstate community input as opposed to probably downstate community input. And it made me think of that when you talked about HCR. because the community input, I know in our region on HCR projects is not, I'm sure, what you're seeing in the downstate area. And so, I think we have to be conscious of that and make sure that it is true community input. And so I just wanted to say that.
Great, thanks, Amy. And Abigail had a very similar point in the chat about, there being a difference between asking for input and then acting on that input. So definitely things that we're also conscious of. I think we should move on. I think I'm turning this over now to Alex for the place-based discussion which relates to the benefits. I'm sorry.
Because I was on stack. Yeah, thank you. I just want to say something about community, because people get really creative in terms of how they define it and how they define leadership. And even in a place like upstate New York, where I'm at in Brooklyn, I perceive as being a place that isn't as diverse as New York, but that is a place where people of color literally get squashed in terms of having a voice because of their numbers or because of the history of leadership in those places. And so because we're talking about environmental justice and we're talking about the disparate impact on people of color, even in those spaces, it is really important that people of color are able to speak for themselves and aren't spoken for and aren't used as poster children of an agenda that is white-led. So I think that that's extremely important. Also, this is an opportunity for us not just to be thinking about climate interventions and energy and workforce development, but it's an opportunity for us to start thinking about radical governance and what that looks like and how we create the space to start engaging in shared leadership in the face of climate change. And meaningful community engagement is the space where we can start showing what that looks like within this work group and within the recommendations that come out of here. And so we can't separate that radical governance and that opportunity to make sure that people are decision makers from the substantive issues that we're proposing. So I think that is something that we need to explore and move away from convention, because we're living in unconventional times. So I just want to offer that, because I think that we go to the default thing, which is community is something that you manage. And it is not just being managed by government, it's being managed by other people within our communities. So anyway, that's it.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth. And that's definitely something that we'll want to work with you all on how we design getting that community input, because we definitely want it to be meaningful engagement and not having representatives speak in the place of the people we're trying to reach. Definitely hear you on that. I don't think I see anybody else in the stack.
Sorry. I was just going to suggest maybe this is I know there's a lot that this group has to focus on over the next few months, but I think like engagement, approaches and strategy, I think could be a good topic for us to kind of talk through here as we're thinking about how we kind of start to apply kind of the need to engage at a different level.
Absolutely, Chris. We can definitely add that to our work plan and have it as an agenda item. Okay. And now I don't see anyone else in the stack. Alex, I believe you are going to talk to us about place-based versus individual.
Yes, I am. I do want to echo the thought about community engagement. There has actually been some really great work in California. I know New York is very different, but there's some really great work that has been done on community engagement within the sense of operationalizing some of the legislation that they've done. And I think that could be a nice thing to bring in as well. So especially from the EJ community, having them talk about how they've engaged would be great. Okay, place-based versus individual definitions. Please speak up at any point when we're having this conversation. I think this is one of the most important kind of bits of conversation that we're going to have, is how do we add this to the definition, incorporate it? Where do we place the individual versus the place-based components of this? And this this has so many different facets to it. So I've got a lot of words on the page, but bear with me as I try to speak through kind of a bit of the conceptualization here. And one is that some of this is process about when timing is going to come in. Some of this is also that place-based versus individual definitions might be a misnomer in some ways, because there are things that we can do with the place-based definition where we are making sure that, say, upstate versus downstate New York are still equally, looked at, so that we're not overemphasizing one area over the other. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have an individual element to that definition, but rather we can, as we move to these indicators and narrow them down and put them into, say, one score, which will be ideal, we can look at that distribution and start saying, well, this is what it looks like for upstate, this is what it looks like for downstate. So I just want to make the point that some of this is murky in of itself. It's such a complex ball of wax we're trying to tease out, right? But I wanted to go through a couple thoughts here, and that is, obviously, this is a really important decision to make, but I also think it's a decision that we're going to have to tap into several times across this process. And that's because, as Chris pointed out, we've got 3 different work streams going on pretty much at the same time, trying to address this very issue. But at the same time, this working group really needs to get at a community kind of definition for disadvantaged communities so that we can kind of get things going. And in particular, I think it's just really, really important to have some element of a place-based definition. So that's kind of, as a starting point, I think a really good place to start. But that does not mean, and it certainly is pretty vital, that we talk through individual characteristics in other areas as well. So I wanted to hear from you. This is just an element here that we can talk through. I have a couple other slides if we need to about different options, but really I wanted to hear from you where you're sitting in this perspective. We know that there are some individual characteristics that we would like to have, at least when talking through the benefits. But we also know that, particularly with this conversation about community engagement, community organizations, and how they're going to work through this, how do we balance the two? So I would love to hear from you. How do we balance the need for a community designation versus an individual element to it? And where in the process do you want to see that happen?
I'm not seeing any hands or items in the chat.
Then I'm going to throw another slide at you to help give you a little bit more context.
One quick question. Dr. Dunn, if I...
I've never used my honorific more than today.
I couldn't resist taking the bait. Sorry about that. I just want, this is just something that it may be obvious, but I just want to kind of remind all of us, right, that what we're trying to do with the Climate Justice Working Group is look at how to ensure investments, whether it's in urban, densely populated communities of color, or in maybe more white, rural, more dispersed communities. The whole point of this portion of the law was to ensure that funding went to the most disproportionately both burdened and the most disproportionately vulnerable communities in the state, which means that we're talking about just 35 to 40%, right? The other 60% of the rest of the state's funding is gonna go where it's gonna go. And I just want folks to remember that what we're trying to do is protect investments in communities that are often overlooked, but there is 60% of funding that's gonna do what that, as one of our colleagues said, state's gonna state. Right, so it's something I think that we're talking about the entire funding stream. No, we're only talking about 35 to 40%. So sorry, Doctor. Keep going.
Thanks,
Sorry.
Eddie. Eddie, that's a great reminder. I'll just add to it that while 35% is the floor, 40% is the goal, and that means the state could go over. And you know, I think a lot of people hope that we do go over it. But to your point, Eddie, thank you for that reminder. Anybody else?
Can I just add something?
Yes.
Dr. Dunn, you could just call me Elizabeth Esquire, since we're doing that. I know women got to do this. So one of the things that we haven't talked about, and I know it's not specifically addressing the 4 pieces you've listed here, but one of the things, but it is, I'm also thinking about something that was triggering on the chat, is that when we try to engage community, we engage community with the assumption that they actually know what we're talking about. And so that they then have to respond and compete with other people who may be civic happy or who may have a formal education, and that there needs to be this piece that comes before that, where people are provided with the information that they need so that they can make informed decisions, and we could level the playing field. And so even before, because it's easy to engage community, and a community can come in and start talking to you about potholes when you're talking to them about pot. You know, okay, I'm being funny. But my point is that because our communities are struggling with 2 or 3 jobs and taking care of children, for them to come out and for them to participate, it means that they are making a big sacrifice. And so we need to front end that with a lot of information that is accessible and digestible so that they can put together their brain trust and inform us about what their priorities are. And it really is fundamentally unfair for us to expect people who are in a place of struggle to do that without having that information and to fast track it. That's the other thing, to give it to them and expect them to respond immediately without them having had an opportunity to digest it over time so that they can show up in a way that's meaningful. And then having privileged people just be the smartest people in the room and really sort of like hijack these meetings. So in moving forward, as we're talking about place-based and individuals, what that process looks like needs to integrate that. To make it meaningful, it means people need to know what's at stake. They need to know what the opportunities are so that then they can weigh in a way that makes sense for them. And so I just wanted to add that because I've not seen that piece. And so it makes it hard sometimes for me to respond.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth.
I think that's a really great point. Trying to, again, that's part of all of this coming forward, right? At least we at Loom have been tasked with different parts of, you know, the numbers and the statsy fun part for my brain, but also keeping in mind the information to support is a huge part of this. So I think that we need to keep all of that in mind when we go through there. Dan, I see your comment about trusted messengers. I think is just really important. So one of the things.
Dr. Dunn, can I also just direct respond very quickly to that very triggering comment? Is that, you know, many of us were invited to be part of the Climate Justice Working Group because we're actually doing place-based work in our own communities and have been doing it for years. Mm-hmm. We know how to engage our community members. We know how to talk to them and have that level of cultural competency. We also, many of us, if we're successful in what we do in being intermediaries or leading organizations, it's because we actually are doing what the community wants in the way that they've asked for it, right? And that does take time. But to say that that community members can be obstacles in implementation and all that and only be seen as advisory, part of, you know, why there hasn't been so much success and why these policies and systems exist is because things are always happening to community members that they knew nothing about and maybe not necessarily want or even know how to access. And so I think the point that we're trying to make in particular with these investments is to say there are already people on the ground doing this. How do we work together? And much of it is actually going to require a shift in our thinking. I think part of, you know, us, I'm going to speak for myself, me being part of this advisory group and even taking in the information in the way it's coming. This is not how we normally think. These are not so we're also at the same time translating it in our brains and kind of helping to shift the narrative and shift the ways of working so that it actually works for everyone, right? In particular, our community members that we are serving. I think the other thing that is been weighing on me lately is that this shift and this change with this law is going to impact everyone. And there's a lot of engagement, deep level engagement that has to happen in order for folks to understand what is happening and what the impacts are going to be for them. But for when you're talking about like vulnerable populations and low income folks and all of the people that we're trying to serve, these drastic shifts and changes are not going to be easy. And so I think our job as being the Climate Justice Working Group is really trying to create the best criteria and the best ways of making this transition happen so that we don't hurt these already impacted vulnerable people even more and disrupt their lives in a way that is impossible.
Great, thank you, Rowan, for bringing us back with your comments. Alex, I think we have the draft evaluation rubric that we'd like to talk about before the advisory panels get here. So if everyone doesn't mind, I think we can move on to that next slide. But I'm definitely pinning that we're gonna have to keep having this conversation, particularly around meaningful engagement with the very communities that we are trying to make this definition work for our January session. So thank you everyone for your comments.
Yeah, and just to reiterate, as I mentioned, this is something that we'll have to go back to many times. So we're just putting it front and center that we recognize that. But to kind of push on to the draft rubric, which hopefully all of you have taken a look at, I wanted to do two things. One is to go through a couple slides that go and give you kind of the high level different criteria that we're talking about. And then we've created an Excel sheet with those criteria and a few example indicators, and then done the grading ourselves. And let me tell you, it's challenging, but that's the point, right? To talk through all of these and try to narrow them down. So let's dive into the draft rubric. Again, please speak up anytime if you have questions. We can go to the next slide. So the rubric is based on the legislation, and what we wanted to do here was to separate by pillar questions and create questions basically that we could grade the indicator on. And so what we're trying to do with the first pillar, if this indicator is meant to inform what this pillar is to say, does it represent pollution or hazards that lead to negative public health effects? Or does it capture the cumulative legacy of environmental pollution or hazards? Second pillar would be represent people or communities who have historically experienced disparities in clean energy or energy efficiency investments or services. Does it represent people or communities who have historically experienced discrimination in the areas of housing, workforce development, pollution reduction, low-income energy assistance, energy transportation, or economic development? Then for pillar 3, does it reflect environmental or climate conditions or events that may be exacerbated by climate change? Or does it capture the population or community characteristics that exacerbate risks of climate change? These are vital questions to be asking. And so what we have done in the rubric is actually create a rating scale, a 1, 2, or 3 rating scale, so that we're trying to give the understanding that this is not always the most easy thing. There's a gradation across these and how well things answer.
So, Dr. Dunn, I like this. The one thing that I think needs a little specificity is that when we are looking at the impact of emissions or communities with a legacy of environmental racism, we also need to look at a people that have been descendants of extraction and of slavery. And the reason that's important is that if you create, if you're mapping, for example, carbon, and if you're mapping co-pollutants, people may assume that everyone gets impacted a certain way, but if you have a migration of people, or if you've got people who come from that legacy of access to poor healthcare and are more susceptible because of that, that needs to be captured. So number 2 of the third pillar, capture population or community characteristics that exacerbate risk, I think that's a really important one. And also somehow we need to capture migration in there. So for example, if you've got a group of brown people that are moving upstate to do farming and they are being exposed to pesticides, or they're in harm's way because of extreme weather events, that's not place-based, but that is people-based. And so I think that we need to be able to sort of, I don't know if I'm being clear, but I think we need to tweak that a little bit, because it isn't always place-based. Sometimes it's people-based because of who the people are.
Yeah. I'm trying to think through the operationalization of that, and I'm wondering whether, because you can come at this in multiple ways. So there are these rubrics that we can rate the different indicators on, but we can also make sure that we're capturing that by making sure that we have some indicators, like I think race and ethnicity, or the population or the distribution of race and within an area. And so that would be within the indicator that we could then create. And so it's coming at it from a different perspective. And that might be the way that we make sure that that happens. But you're absolutely right. We need to capture that kind of migration. And I'm wondering whether in the list, and Amanda, if you can take note of looking at migratory patterns, whether there is an indicator that has some kind of component of that, might be another way of looking at it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Jody, you have a comment. I feel like one aspect that is missed, maybe because it's hard to measure, is a positive language of inclusion in looking systematically at all solutions. Do the solutions support community-based networks, which will inherently help focus on local and reduce needs for travel? One of the things I want to talk through is this is the applicability, but then there's the actionable. So next slide. Thank you for that, by the way. Any other comments on this slide before I move forward? Okay, we'll keep going. Okay, so this one is, and this is, I think, where, Jody, we're going to have some conversation about trying to make this fit and work. This is, to me, this was the hardest part of grading the indicators, because it's just hard. This is a really, really hard one. But what we're trying to do is make sure that with the indicators that we have, are they actionable? Can we do something about it? Can this actually do something about it? And I must admit this was the trickiest one. But here we're trying to ask how well does the indicator represent exposure, risks, threats, or vulnerabilities that are potentially actionable by New York State agencies, and then nuanced but still different, represent exposures, risks, threats, or vulnerabilities that could be addressed by clean energy or energy efficiency investments.
Sonal, you have a question?
Yeah, I've just been thinking about the first one, and I'm wondering if maybe someone can kind of explain a little bit more and operationalize the word potentially, or the words potentially actionable. I think sometimes there is disagreement between like the state and maybe EJ groups and believing what is an actionable thing. So just wondering if someone can expand a little bit more on that.
I can try to touch on that. Can you guys hear me? I think, one interpretation could be kind of under the purview of, or in the kind of stated or regulated responsibilities of those agencies. So maybe actionable could be rephrased, but something that agencies are known to have responsibility for, have programs for. Anyone else have a different interpretation, or how would you like to have it read?
Just a quick question. Unless I misinterpreted it, I think that could be helpful, because part of what I think we be like, one of my opening questions was about, will we be able to use this tool as they do in California for more than just investments? So potentially actionable can include permits, can include, you know, other official acts by state agencies that could either increase or decrease, you know, vulnerability and you know, and exposures. So anyways, I just want to make a pitch for you know, being expansive, or at least understanding that actionable doesn't just have to be investments.
Okay.
I guess the one other thing I might just chime in on here, and Sonal, if I'm kind of misinterpreting, please correct me. I think what you're getting at is like how outside the box is the state thinking about solutions, because there's certainly, you know, kind of business as usual, the way the state does things. And then there's the what has to happen to really address the climate crisis. And I think this gets to what Elizabeth was saying, you know, that we really need a new model. So, you know, what that definition of potentially actionable does strike me as potentially problematic also, just because there's so much room for interpretation there, you know, like what is practical or doable versus like, what do we actually need to do? And Sonal, again, like, please, if I'm kind of misinterpreting what you're trying to get at. But I guess I would just end with, I would like to see us think outside the box and, you know, kind of stretch the bounds of what has been considered potentially actionable in the past.
I think that's a good addition. Thanks.
Yeah, I like that. And I think maybe what we can do is I want to table the specific word changes to the potentially actionable for when we start looking at the actual examples, because I found it particularly challenging because I was trying to think of, well, how can this be directly addressed? And then there's actually like 50 ways that you can indirectly address it. So which I think, Abigail, is what you're trying to say, which is like, we need to think outside of the box and try to get that. So let's table that. But know that this is, I think, the part that will need to be fiddled with a little bit, but very important to also make sure that it's there, right? So that if we're looking at indicators that can't be addressed or can't be looked at in some way, then I don't know if they're useful for us to include into the designation. Okay, next slide. So this was us trying to think of how a lot of these indicators are related to one another, because so much of this is, right? So there's a lot of correlation, which I know is a technical term, but the idea that things are just kind of indicate the same or at least similar overlap in what they would be able to predict. And so statistically speaking, this was something that Amanda and I kept thinking about is how do we make sure that we have some overlap, because that's really good in these types of models to make sure we have some overlap, but that each indicator is still contributing a little bit that's really useful and informative. And so this was a very technical component to make sure that you know, it's a core variable. Is it important? And then also, is it essential and unique? So the questions we were asking here is how directly does the indicator represent, say, that factor or the concept that we're trying to measure here? That does not, and what I'm talking about with a concept is not necessarily either the pillars or the disadvantaged community designation as a whole, but rather a small element that we know goes into that larger component. So is it a direct measure of things? So in this case, air pollution versus an indirect measure like storm surge risk. Sorry, environmental hazards, those kinds of things. And in here, I've got another example of income is a direct measure of poverty. Food stamps is an indirect measure of poverty, of that measure. They're related, they inform one another in many ways, but one's direct and one's less direct. How essential and unique is the indicator to the DAC criteria? And in this case, it's hard But what we're trying to do here is, again, that overlap, making sure that there is something that that indicator is contributing. Because if there is an indicator that is slightly better, we don't need to, and that basically is subsumed, like one indicator is subsumed by the other, we don't need to include this indicator. That just makes our model worse, statistically speaking. So this was our Statsy one. Any comments or thoughts on this? Okay. Now the final one is data sufficiency and quality. In this case, what we need is the indicators need to be of a certain quality for us to really use them across the whole state with a certain level of granularity. And so is it available statewide at the geographic level that we need? So whether it's census tract or block groups, those geographic levels are really, really important. Now we can do some transformations so that things can work, but only if it's a really good indicator, because for the most part, we would really like to have everything as accurate as possible at the geographic level that we need. Is it considered accurate with limited measurement error? And in this case, within the measurement error, the idea is a lot of these indicators and data points are based on samples. And sometimes the methods that they gather the data on are just not very good, or they're capturing small samples and it's not very effective or helpful. And that could actually end up really messing with our model. So we're trying to assess the measurement error to make sure that we have good data, not erroneous data for certain things. Is it current, up to date? I think this one's kind of funny because what I view as current, kind of 2018, 2019, 2020, some things are available in 2012, and that felt up to date after a while when we started looking at the indicators. And then finally, is it possible to obtain and include within the timeline that we need?
Okay, we have Eddie in the stack.
Thanks. Actually, before I go, I think Amanda had posted I don't know if it's a question or a point. I'll wait for you guys to look at that.
Oh, I just wanted to provide that in response to Elizabeth's question and comment earlier, and how all the different ways that might be available to capture the people who live in an area, regardless of where they may have migrated from.
Gotcha. No, thank you for that. Appreciate it. Thank you. I'm sorry. Yeah, I saw the whole thing now, and I thought it was a question at the end. No, thank you, Amanda. All great points. Two quick things. One is, I just want to make sure I understand the way the rubric memo laid this out. The idea was, I'm going to make sure I'm understanding. It sounds like the idea was the applicability of the kind of 8 pillars, or the 8 versus 14. Like that was, it kind of stuck out at me. I was just wondering. It felt a little arbitrary. Like I was just wondering why, if you could just spend a second or two to talk about why the 8 versus the 14. Let me ask a more important question than that, though, which is the number 11 was about the availability statewide of geographic. Yeah, one of the things that I've been grappling with this whole process is one of the more traditional ways of looking at EJ and disproportionate impacts. It's the proximity of low-income people and people of color to manufacturing zones, which is where the most polluting heavy industrial uses are only allowed. And apparently, which is a little stunning to me, there doesn't appear to be a statewide database of all of the manufacturing zone land in the state. Look, I get that zoning is a local matter, but every municipality, town, and village and city has a zoning resolution. They can tell you, state of New York, what are the manufacturing zones and industrially zoned land. And I'm just wondering, even though there is not currently a statewide available database of manufacturing land, it ought to be, should be. And I'm just wondering, how do we grapple with what's an essential EJ exposure land use decision from applying this rubric, which is a statewide application.
I'm wondering whether we can we can come at that analytically speaking, in the sense of, if we know that there are places where we have those data, and then we can look at things that correlate with it. So we have those data and we can start looking at the correlations that happen along with that. So are there health metrics that we can use that then are statewide, that we know then kind of relate to this, and then apply that statewide? That might be a proxy. It's not, because those data are not statewide, I worry that including them only in one area is going to kind of differentiate the definition across the state, and that could be problematic looking down the line, especially if you want to apply this in different areas or in different kind of outside of this core use case that we're talking about. But I do think that we can get at it, and I think that the trick then is to try to figure out how to operationalize that. So it will take some analysis, but there. And Amanda's jumping in her seat to answer you too. So
I'm jumping in my seat. I think this is such a good question, especially for, you know, what we can do in the short term versus creating a wish list of getting a list like this together. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at the indicator list, but we kind of grouped the wish list of indicators by factor or concept. So something like proximity to manufacturing zones might be in a category with things like proximity to hazardous waste sites that are on a known list of hazardous waste sites, or regulated management areas, or Superfund sites. So I think some of this, there might be a trade-off to say, okay, we really want to get at proximity to manufacturing zones, but here are the variables we have. We have this variable from a federal list and this variable from a federal list. So what can we use that gets us as close to that proximity question that we have, and maybe say, okay, well, maybe in the short term we can use, you know, proximity to these types of sites which are already in EJ screen, and then long term, you know, identify that as a gap for agencies.
Right, and also add
opportunity zones.
Yeah, I'll also add that part of the thing we're doing with the state staff team is investigating, are these things on the wish list something we could put together in the time constraint we have for this activity, or is that going to be a longer term thing? So getting to your point, Eddie, of, you know, can New York actually just compile this information from the local governments? And I think, Abigail, I think you are on the stack.
Thank you, Rosa. So where I'm really just keep tripping up, and I'm hoping you guys can talk me through this, is, you know, this point number 1 here about available statewide at the geographic level needed. And, you know, it says right here, pending decision on geographic level. So based on, you know, just our participation in NYSERDA programs as an organization, it appears that there's pretty good data available at the household level for various, you know, different criteria. You know, in terms of being able to target households for said program. And maybe I'm wrong about that, so you can correct me about that. But, you know, NYSERDA has given us access to some information to be able to target specific households based on criteria. And where I just don't understand, and again, please help me understand, why we need it to be geographic level versus household level is, you know, very concrete example. NYSERDA right now is running this program it's a pilot program and just in a few regions, one of which is most of the city of Rochester, where, you know, if you live in the right place, you automatically qualify for assisted home performance. And yeah, again, it's most of the city of Rochester minus a few of the, you know, really affluent neighborhoods. One of the households that's included though in that, you know, pilot region is my house. And I do not qualify. I mean, I wouldn't otherwise qualify for that program, you know, based on income level. So if that's how, you know, the benefits are, or the investment is being divvied out, and I qualify because I live in the right neighborhood, which is definitely a mixed income neighborhood. Plenty of my neighbors shouldn't qualify either. So that's where I'm having a lot of trouble understanding why it makes sense to do it at a, you know, census tract or block group level.
Yeah. I see that there's someone in the stack. Jared, did you want to converse about this, or I can touch upon Abigail's point? Okay.
Sorry, I actually have a question.
Okay.
So you can answer, and then I'll
I'll go for it. There's no good solid answer, but I will say this. In my experience, working with utilities across the country trying to target and be very specific at the household level, that there really isn't good data, or at least solid enough. And so then it's like, what is the best method, knowing that there's some error? Just like you, I live in a pretty impoverished area because it's where we wanted to live, and we should not be taking advantage of those programs. And in fact, California was just discussing this with us. They actually have layered on individual criteria on top of their place-based ones for certain programs. And this might be something that you want to think about. So it's, again, that place-based versus individual, I think that there's a nuance there that needs to be thought of. But one of the things I would say is that in my experience, I think it's really, really important for us to think through, or important for this group to think through how a geographic designation can empower groups that have often not been seen or are very hard to find, and in particular I'm thinking multifamily and people who are moving and more migratory. Those are very, very hard to identify within program implementation kind of databases and things like that. That all said, I think this is something to talk through. And I know, Rosa, we're running through time. So I wanted to do a time check, and I also want to make sure that I'm answering the questions that need to be there. So
I think let's take Jared's question and then try to get through the example run, because we do have the panelists coming on now, and I also wanted to schedule in a 5-minute stretch break for everybody as well.
Okay, thank you, Rosa. So this is a question specifically about the structure of the rubric. And I'm sure you all thought through this, but my question is, during the process or the sequencing of evaluating the indicators, we have this portion of it, the data sufficiency and quality. These are like quantitative kind of evaluation parameters. Why are they at this point in the evaluation and not at the top to kind of filter out bad indicators that don't have sufficient accuracy or quality right from the get-go, instead of waiting until we get down to this point in the sequence, before having the quantitative before the qualitative pillars,
components of it? I think that one of the things that we wanted to do was give not necessarily equal weight to all of these considerations, but recognize that there might be some data points that may not be as good quantitatively, but then are qualitatively so important that we want to think about, at least for future things. And so we wanted to capture all of the elements in the rubric because they're important. That said, and let me show you in the example, one of the things that I think is really important to talk through here is that this rubric is not meant to get us to the final set of indicators that we are going to be using for the definition or the designation, but rather it's the first step. And so we're trying to cast a wider net and then computationally and analytically then analyze what we have together and see what works. And then present you with multiple scenarios, because one of the things I'm really hoping that this group, which is a solid set of experts within these areas, is to look at the different indicators and be like, yeah, that's not a good one, and have your information, not ours, to do that. But then also the point of this is that as we go computationally through this and we can get a bunch of maps of very specific neighborhoods and areas and say, like, this one has a very high score with this scenario, but slightly lower in this one. Does that fit your known experience of those areas? Because I don't have that known experience, but you do. And so we need to use that known kind of experience to help us verify if this computational model that we'll end up with is real or useful.
Okay, yeah, I think that makes sense. So as a follow-on question, I guess it begs a question, in the interest of time, should we just go straight to the computational assessment structure, or is it going to be actually helpful to go through the rubric and do a double pass on every single indicator?
Oh, we need to pass because we have like 120 or more indicators, and the list keeps growing. And there are some that I think you all will have strong opinions about, and we need to know those now because, you know, any model that we do, when I'm gonna get all technical and get into my exploratory factor analysis craziness, like I don't want to add so many things. You get spurious models that way, and we're going to be using some data mining techniques that you have to be applying the theory and the conceptual part first before you go into the data mining, because that's when bad things happen, analytically speaking, when you add too much stuff in.
Okay, I appreciate that. I trust in the efficacy of the rubric, and I'm looking forward to the examples.
Cool.
Great. Alex, did you need me to switch you to presenter for the next piece?
You do, so I can get to the Excel sheet. So
okay, great.
I need a ball. Where's that thing?
Got it.
Okay, I'm now the presenter. So now I can share content and I can go to this screen. Can you all see a fancy little upside down triangle? Yes, okay. So this is my fancy way of trying to visually represent that we are here at this like gray box, and then we're going to analyze, and then we're going to narrow it down again. So the idea here is to narrow things down a little bit so that we can get to the analysis part. But we don't want to narrow so much that, you know, we're getting down to the very basics. So let me take you through this, and please let me know, is this legible for people, or can you read it? Nope. Okay, we're gonna make it big as soon as I can try to get to it.
And you also, this was part of your materials, if it's easier for you to view it on a separate screen.
Yeah, is this now legible-ish? Yes, okay. So one of the things that we wanted to set up is ideally have this bit of information. So you've got the pillar name, the factor, the concept that it's trying to measure. And this is something that we kind of went ahead and tried to fill in as best we could. The indicator, the specific name of the indicator, and the metric of what it really is, kind of like the definition of what this indicator is. The data source for it, the year range or where it's come from. This is to help us verify how old it is. The smallest geographic area that we can get to. Is it already available, or do we have to transform it? And this is just more of a timing thing, just so we know what's going on. And it, like, is it, you know, there? So we're going to have to try to figure out ways of getting that transformation or asking for those data, et cetera, et cetera. But I wanted to go through a couple of these examples, and I think, you know, we might just have time for one, and that means two. We're going to go through two indicators because I want to compare and contrast how we will look through these. For the environmental pollution and hazards pillar, we are trying to then look at the NATA, N-A-T-A respiratory hazard index. And also we have another one, which is the asthma ED visit data. So the first one is the ratio of exposure of concentration to healthy level, and then the average annual age-adjusted asthma ED visits.
And I just want to clarify that these are just two examples from the list. There's many other indicators that have been suggested for environmental pollution and hazards. So it's not like we're really deciding between both of these. This is just us, you know, contrasting it for this exercise.
Good disclaimer. Yes. This is definitely not the end all be all, but we chose these because they kind of do help to show the differences between how we would rate these. So one comes from EPA EJ screen, and the other one is from New York State DOH. And the date range of those, the date, 2014 versus 2008 to 2012. And then this one comes at the census tract versus the aggregated area ID. And that means that the first one is available at the census tract level. The other one is not, but we could probably ask DOH to get that, or may.
Well,
yeah. Amanda, did you want to say something?
This isn't totally updated to our recent discussions, but so the aggregated area, and this is for future discussion, but the aggregated area ID was something that the Department of Health developed to deal with unstable data at really small rates in places where the counts of something were so small that it seemed like, if you publish something with a really small count, it might be giving you kind of a false sense of what the true differences are between small areas. So they found, places where some of the counts were small, instead of publishing at a census tract level, aggregated some census tracts. And this is also referred to as the sub-county area, just as a reference.
Yep. Okay. Okay, so I want to move forward pretty quickly because I want to make sure that we're getting through things. And then I would say if we want to, we can also go through this in more depth as a separate thing, or you also have this. So here we were rating from 0 of not well to 3 extremely well. How well does this indicator, the respiratory hazard index, kind of represent the pollutions or hazards that lead to negative public health effects? And in this case, we gave this one a 3, but the asthma ED visits, while giving some information, was not as well, so moderately well. Does it capture the cumulative legacy of environmental pollution hazards? The respiratory hazard index, no. The ED visit, no. So less well, moderately well. And then here's the tricky one. The actionable, is it potentially actionable by New York State agencies? We didn't feel like the respiratory hazard index was, so moderately well. But it could be addressed by clean energy or energy efficiency investments. And again, this was the hardest one. So we didn't feel like the asthma ED visits could be actionable by New York State agencies at all. But we did feel like clean energy and energy efficiency investments could address asthma ED visits to a certain extent. Contribution to things. We ended up adding this extra bit to help answer things. One is because there are some core variables like income that we think are just absolutely vital to be included. And so we wanted to add this, is it core mentioned in the legislation? And if it is, then we give this a 1 because it will help us answer whether it is then essential or unique outside of the core variables. If it's not a core variable, then is it going to help us give any more information? So in this case, for going back to the indicator of direct indicator measure of the concept, we said it was a direct measure, as opposed to the ED visits for asthma, that's an indirect measure. So respiratory hazard measure or index is a direct measure of what it's trying to measure. And then ED visits would be almost a result of it. This got me thinking that later down the line, asthma ED visits could be a nice way to assess some things. And so this is something that we can think of later, is none of these indicators are going to necessarily fall down or fall away from everything we do, but some may actually help us to measure the effectiveness of some of these programs down the line. As an evaluator, I feel like that's an important thing to pull out. Is it essential or unique? In this case, the respiratory hazard index, knowing that there's some other ones here, are, I think, kind of it slightly is correlated, which is a good thing. And in this case, not correlated at all, the ED visit, so that's even better. The bigger scores are better scores in this case, so we can add them all up. And then the data sufficiency, is it at the geographic level we need? Yes, for this one, less so, but there are some limitations. Is it accurate with some limited measurement error? It's pretty good. And then this one, there's a lot less I think, confidence in some of the specifics of it. Is it current, up to date? This was hard to answer. Is 2014 up to date? In my view, no. But then again, with the data that we have, some of it is considered up to date. And can we get it in the timeline that we need? And so that in this case, both were 3s. I ran through that wicked fast because I had to. But
Great. Thanks, Alex. I appreciate how you were able to sum that up. Working group members, again, this was, we promised we would show you how we could use the draft rubric, and we already got a lot of your input on the rubric itself. We're definitely going to have more engagement on this. Some of it will be offline and we're going to follow up, but I did want to turn us to the panels because I know our representative from the Just Transition Working Group is on and has another engagement at 2 p.m. So I'd like to move us now to the Just Transition Working Group. Laura Skinner, I believe you are on to give us an overview of what your working group is tackling, and then we'll have some engagement between you and the working group members.
Hi there, Rosa. Can you hear me and see me?
Yes, we got you.
Okay, great. All right. Well, thanks for having me join this group. Looking forward to sharing out some of the thinking from our group and hearing more about what you all are tackling in this working group. In terms of what we've been doing in the Just Transition Working Group, I'll mention a couple of kind of background pieces. One, that we're really thinking about this is not just a climate and greenhouse gas emissions issue, but this is really about a major, job creation and economic development opportunity for the state, and, an opportunity to build an equitable economy and an equitable clean energy economy that, in particular supports the communities that have been most impacted by climate change and pollution, and workers who have been most impacted or will be most impacted by the transition. And so a big piece of our thinking about this is, are there good jobs to transition to? So not only are we protecting and supporting workers and communities that are going to be impacted by the shutdown of plants and high carbon activities, but are we ensuring that there are going to be good, high quality family and community sustaining jobs with good benefits and good training programs that support them to transition to, right, in this new clean energy economy. And I would say, currently in New York, we don't have good standards that ensure these new jobs will be good jobs, high quality, high paying jobs with good benefits. And so that's something that we feel like needs to be a big focus as we think about how to tackle climate change and build out this clean energy economy. And, some of you know that, we had some success in, making sure that, offshore wind construction jobs would be good jobs, but we need to think about this more broadly because, that's just one piece of the clean energy industry, and there are not standards on the rest of the clean energy economy. And I think the other piece of it is, ensuring those new jobs will be good jobs, but also what are we doing as a state to really sort of attract the clean energy industry to the state? So it's one thing, and again, I'll use the offshore wind industry as an example. It's a great thing for us to have a 9 gigawatt goal, for us to be building offshore wind farms to reach that goal, but will we also be taking action as a state and not just leaving it to the market in terms of attracting assembly, manufacturing, port work to the state of New York, where there's an opportunity for us to be sort of a regional center for the offshore wind industry. And this is true for a lot of other parts of the clean energy economy as well. And can we look at where we have strengths already and really build on those in terms of, thinking about our manufacturing supply chain and, our workforce talent here in New York. So, that's two big things we're thinking about. One, are there good jobs to transition to? And two, are we doing more than just, meeting our targets, but really thinking about this as a major job creation and economic development opportunity and attracting the clean energy industry to the state. I think the other thing that we're thinking about is The Department of Labor currently has what they call a rapid response program, and they support workers and communities when a facility or a plant or a business closes down. This is great. And we need to recognize that, New York's transition to a clean energy economy to address the climate crisis is a major economic transition, right? This is not about just one plant closing down. This is about, us, transitioning a whole economy, a whole high carbon sector to a low carbon sector. And there are, significant labor, employment, social, and community impacts to that transition. And so I think, our response as a state really needs to be commensurate with that scale and pace of the transition that we're looking at to address the climate crisis. And that means that we need to think really cohesively and comprehensively about how we support workers and communities through this massive transition. So not, a piecemeal approach, but let's really think big about what this transition looks like and how we're going to support folks through it. And I think one of the main things that we hear from workers and communities who are impacted by this transition and by certain economic activities closing down or plants closing down is that they wish that they had a lot more advance notice, multiple years notice, right? Because if you're shutting down the main economic engine of community, you need years to rebuild that engine. So, again, just, we really need to map out this transition and approach it in a comprehensive and cohesive way. And so that's a big thing that we've been thinking about is how do we map this out, right? From now until, 2030, 2040, 2050, can we really sort of look at, okay, where are we going to be, shutting down power generation or other high carbon sectors? Where do we need to be adding new stuff based on the communities that have already been impacted by pollution and climate change, based on where we need power in our grid, all of those factors, right? But really map it out so that we can give communities the full support that they need to make sure that we're building, an equitable clean energy economy. And we're, as part of our working group, we are doing a study that's going to look more closely at what workers and communities are going to be impacted as we shut down certain economic sectors. And so I think that's important and will be really helpful to sort of understanding, what's the sort of support that we're going to need to help out workers and communities. And then on a more sort of mechanical side, I would just say, there's a number of things that we should think about in terms of how we support workers and communities through this transition. I would say that Tammy Burse, a legislator in Illinois, has introduced some really great just transition legislation that we're sort of looking at and, thinking could provide some, good guidance on how we approach this in New York. But it's things like providing higher ed at public colleges and universities for free to workers who've been impacted by the transition and their families, providing Medicare to all impacted workers for a certain period of time. Of course, some sort of wage and benefit replacement for a certain period of time until folks are transitioned into a new economic activity. Obviously establishing tax credits and more forms of direct public support to spur new clean energy development. I think, we can figure out where do we need to be building new clean energy projects. And, there's a whole host of ways that we can sort of figure that out. But how do we actually support it publicly and make sure that that happens? If a region is losing a major economic engine, can we look at what other activities are going to continue in that region and make sure that we're giving priority and preference to those activities so that they can continue and grow and hopefully absorb some of the job loss that's occurring in the region and support workers. Having grant coordinators at the state and federal level who are assigned to certain communities to help them through the transition, I think is important. And then, of course, there's some stuff around more specific stuff around modifying bankruptcy rules so that if a company, declares bankruptcy, they can't sort of walk away from their obligations to the workers and the communities because they've declared bankruptcy. So those are some specific things. Let me see if there's anything else on our list here. I think those are the main things. How do we think big about this transition and really sort of, match the scale and pace of how we need to tackle the climate crisis and how quickly we need to move this transition and make sure that our support for workers and communities is really commensurate in that respect.
Thank you,
So,
Laura.
thanks.
And I know you have to leave at 2, but we have Eddie Bautista would like to ask a question or give a comment, and then Elizabeth. Over to you, Eddie.
Oh, sorry, the connection faded there for a second. Hey, Lara, thanks so much. Great to see you. I just I don't know whether or not in the Just Transition group, and I'm concerned because as Elizabeth pointed out earlier in the chat, we don't believe that there's any EJ representative on the Just Transition panel. A lot of EJ folks are growing increasingly concerned about some of the quote unquote newer clean technology proposals that are making the rounds, like green hydrogen, with no discussion about how green hydrogen in other deployments to spikes in NOx, for example. We have a variety of concerns when it comes to carbon capture, sequestration, and biofuels. I'm just a little worried that labor in that space may be hearing about these clean, quote unquote, clean technologies as potential silver bullets without the concomitant EJ skepticism and deep concern about some of these technologies. So I'm just wondering, how are you guys hearing in your working group that there are EJ concerns with, say, green hydrogen and carbon capture sequestration? Because if not, I worry about a potential divide coming up between labor and EJ, which none of us obviously want to see. So yeah, I'm just wondering if you guys in that group are hearing some of those concerns from the EJ sector.
Eddie, I would say that in my experience on the group, we haven't talked about any of the new forms of clean energy. That hasn't come up in the group, kind of where we're going. It's more sort of retrospectively looking, but I think that's a great point and a conversation we should absolutely have. And my understanding is there's going to be a number of these kind of panel engagements where folks from different groups will join other groups. So I think it would be a great idea to have folks from this group join the Just Transition working group and have, a specific session dedicated to that.
Thanks, Laura. And very quickly, we have one more comment or question from Elizabeth.
Yeah, Lara, thank you so much. I really appreciate particularly you talking about how the climate solution can become the environmental justice problem. This is the thing that we were thinking about when we were supporting offshore wind and we knew the parts were coming from Europe, was how do we create a supply chain where we identify the companies in the US so that we can make it here? What is the timeline that's required to start making it locally? That's really important. There is a disconnect between unions and community. And even in the way that it's phrased shows that there's a difference in workers, and we talk about communities without recognizing that the workers actually live in our communities. Those are our people that are being exposed to all of this toxicity on a regular basis. And that toxicity, and that framing makes it possible for union leaders who really have been patriarchal and capitalist in their approach to addressing climate problems really makes it a lot more difficult for us. So I really appreciate, Lara, that you to navigate your way between spaces where unions are really kind of out of touch and are benefiting from all of the work that we're doing on the ground in the climate justice movement. And but I think it's really also important to use the Just Transition space as a way of educating workers so that they know that they're benefiting from the work that is being done by community leaders, because we consider them part of our communities. So we need to start framing it a little differently. Otherwise, we're always going to be literally, at each other when we really should be building in alignment. We need to be building in alignment. When the rank and file understands that they live in the community and that we're fighting for them, that will put pressure on a really conventional leadership that is disconnected from what our communities need. So I would urge you within the spaces that we're in to continue to do that. Also, NYSERDA is doing some pretty badass work on supply chain with us. And we're also working with New York City Economic Development Corporation, and we're happy to share that with you offline. But thanks for the presentation.
That's great, Elizabeth. That would be great if you could share the supply chain stuff. And I couldn't agree more on, the need to sort of think differently about this union and community piece. And I think, my hope would be that New York can sort of lead the way in building job training, job quality, wage standards into the clean energy industry in a way that's done differently than it's been done in any other place, and is very much linked to community hire, community benefit, and mandated hiring from local communities, but also targeting certain populations, and I think, we have an opportunity to do that. Hopefully in the next legislative session. I think it would be great for us all to work on that together, because it hasn't really been done any other place, and it needs to happen.
Thank you, Laura. Appreciate you coming on to the working group to give us an update on where Just Transition is heading. And next we have the Energy Efficiency and Housing panel. There's a few members listening today to hear from you all, but I'm turning it over to Sadie McEwen. Sadie, are you on?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, we got you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks for asking us to join. We have a great group of people that are from the housing world. We have primarily focused on the built environment. Obviously, that's where a lot of the carbon is developed. And so in looking at buildings, there are lots of considerations, particularly around affordability and small properties, with respect to both regulated affordable housing, but as well as unregulated, naturally occurring affordable housing. The cost to decarbonize and electrify buildings is not cheap today. And so we really have been looking at ways to get there, but also with real consideration around the impacts to affordability for both homeowners as well as renters. We have 5 scope items that I'll touch on. The first one, we tried to consider things that really looked at and touched all buildings. And so the first thing we came out with was code. So we really think that there need to be mandates that require energy efficiency and electrification mandates in the building code. It can't happen overnight because the impacts would be too great, but sort of an overtime approach to, a stretch code that bans fossil fuel and causes buildings to electrify. There are issues with this, of course, because electricity is expensive, and so transitioning off of gas to electric has economic impacts. When we think of environmental justice, a key component of that in the built environment is economic justice, because it goes to people's ability to afford this transition. And so our strategy was really looking at expanding that code, and then really with considerations around LMI households. And then the next scope item that we have been focused on is financing. Again, this requires that somebody somehow pays for it. It's not something that you can just go to the store now and buy these supplies and hire somebody that knows how to do all of this. There's a huge transition, and the cost in the short term is going to be very high. And so everybody's first question when we talk about electrification of a building is, well, who's going to pay for it? We know that incentives are just that. They're to incent change for your first building, not to pay for electrification and decarbonization on every building. We also know that NYSERDA is not a subsidy agency, and so they don't have a resource to pay for this. We also know that affordable housing funds pay for housing to be affordable, not to be carbon neutral or electrified. So there has to be another source of capital that becomes available. And frankly, moving the mortgage markets and private capital to do this is a key component. There's more money in the private markets than anywhere. So we looked at some of the existing infrastructure around, we're looking at the existing infrastructure around incentives and support, things like the Weatherization Assistance Program, some of the utility programs, utility rates. We looked at taxation as a way to, reduce taxes to create cash and or cash flow at a building to help offset the cost of capital to borrow money to do this. But we broadly considered financing incentives. 40% of any and all CLCPA benefits have to go to LMI communities, and so we're very focused on how that money can be driven into the built environment. The next thing we talked about was training and education. it is not widely understood by people that own real estate that they have to decarbonize and electrify their buildings, that they can't hook up to, that they won't be able to hook up to gas in the future, that they have to fully come off of all fossil fuels. When we talk about it as a group, we all know it, we all agree to it. It's easy for us to understand, but broadly educating owners and operators of housing, both single family as well as multifamily, is critical, as well as educating suppliers and contractors, installers, linking education to licensing, and providing other forms of education through, colleges, trade organizations, unions. All of that is very, very important. Consistent education is a key component. We also see as an opportunity to bring up low and moderate income people who need job training. These will be good jobs. These will be good, high-paying jobs. And so, being able to provide workforce training in LMI communities is a critical component. And so, we've talked a lot about that. The next thing that we focused on, let me find my number 4. Here it is technology innovation to drive better, and demonstration to drive better performance in buildings, reduce costs, and increase customer confidence. One of the things that we know about LMI communities that are subsidized by the government is that the government touches that form of housing. So the government can have a say in how it operates. And so the government can have a say in these buildings need to decarbonize and or electrify. But and we have seen affordable housing at the head of the class in trying to decarbonize their buildings through the process of getting subsidy and developing new affordable housing. But the costs are high, and it is inconsistent to have affordable housing bear the burden of scale in innovation and technology because the costs are so high. Rather, we'd like to see innovation and scale in other forms of the built environment, and municipal, hospitals, colleges, and multifamily housing that's not low and moderate income, to drive a scale that will help reduce costs. So by the time it gets to affordable housing, the costs are lower and easier to absorb. So we recognize that there's research and development. I think there's a lot of work that can be done with other groups on the climate action on the CAC around this, and so we're very concerned about reducing the cost to LMI communities and creating opportunities for LMI people to benefit from some of these developments. And then finally, when we think about LMI communities, when we think about this, we also, other things come to mind: resilience, protection from storms, other strategies around how to provide parity and fairness in this type of housing. So there's all kinds of interventions that make housing in LMI communities accessible, resilient, electrified, affordable. All of these things need to be considered together. And so we're really actually very happy about this commission and this process, which is bringing together different silos of government to think across and together about what resources they have to address each of these different facets, so that when we are electrifying and decarbonizing a building, we are also making it more resilient, driving down its energy intensity and usage, making it more affordable by doing that. And so we've been trying to think about ways to be holistic in our approach. And so supporting and coordinating all of these solutions is very important, and improving the building stock to withstand all of the impacts of climate change, from the economic impacts to all of the other physical impacts, is really important. And again, really looking at opportunities in LMI communities, engage all the way down to the residents and the tenants, to be part of that solution, to be aware, and to come forward to participate in some of the opportunities that can come out of transitioning to a clean energy economy. That's a pretty quick run through of what we've been focused on. There's a lot of detail behind all of that. My group is great. It's a lot of time, but we really enjoy coming together regularly and talking about this stuff. So I'm happy to answer any questions, and if the others from my group that are on the phone want to jump in and help, that would be great.
Thank you, Sadie. I see Eddie, you're up first.
I'll go last if you don't mind. It seems like there's a lot of other questions and points. Let me. I'll go at the end.
Yeah, Eddie, I wanna prioritize the working group members, and so far you're the only one who's indicated a comment in the chat box. So feel free to go ahead, or another working group member if you want to weigh in.
Sure. I guess it's a question, and apologies. I'm in a place where the internet is a little spotty, so it faded when you were talking about the financing. I'm just curious, is in the energy efficiency and housing group, have you all talked? There is a proposal that's being discussed in New York City that would involve some form of cap and trade and invest program that does for housing that doesn't exist anywhere in the United States, maybe in Tokyo, that EJ communities are really concerned about. Among the reasons is we have real skepticism about the ability of that model to actually yield, the kind of financial investment for LMI communities that it was purportedly set up to study. Did your group talk about issues having to do with a cap and trade system for financing, or did that not? Hopefully, did that not reach your table?
It didn't really reach our table. What we looked at rather was what are the existing. So one of the comments in the chat is about the frustration around having an affordable housing project that ends up value engineering out all of the sustainability stuff because there's not enough subsidy to pay to decarbonize a building. So we looked at some of the existing resources in affordable housing, like the low-income housing tax credit or the state housing tax credit, and adding a boost to those resources that the industry of affordable housing owners and providers are used to using, and creating additional resources within the ecosystem so that it more seamlessly happens, rather than inventing a new wheel and having yet another layer in the capital stack, which would just frustrate people. Now, that's great for the affordable housing world and that industry of people, but that's only one small segment of the built environment that we're trying to approach. And so we looked at like the weatherization assistance program, which gets to making it the weatherization and electrification, or weatherization electrification assistance program. So it's WEAP instead of WAP, and that infrastructure that exists, creating more jobs in that world to now electrify buildings, bringing in more design professionals, more suppliers, more installers, to broaden and reach further with something that already exists that attaches to the LMI community. We're looking at things like tax abatements. And remember that the multifamily world is under pressure already because of rent regulation, which is very important to affordability, but it's taken away some of their ability to do upgrades and get repaid for them the way they're used to. Not that that was fair or not fair, but we changed the system on them, and now we're adding this other layer. So there needs to be some way to, if you listen to the owners, they say there's not value in real estate, there's cash flow, right? And so you have to create more cash flow to pay for this. So we're focused on ways to do that, and then ways to look at the existing subsidy and resources that are available, and enhancing those. Things like the STAR program, a real estate tax abatement for a homeowner, that if they electrify, maybe they get deeper benefits. There are things like that we're trying to work within, rather than bringing in, although cap and trade is out there, we know it's out there, and there are ways to generate resources for the LMI community through cap and trade. And so any conversation that we have about cap and trade, it would be as a resource to drive towards assisting and supporting the electrification of the LMI community.
Great, thank you, Sadie. And I'll just, in case you didn't see it, Sonal from WEAC put in the chat that exploring WAP is intriguing and something that they are thinking about, and looking forward to hearing more about how that evolves.
And a lot of our solutions, just one last comment, a lot of our solutions are broader because they involve federal. But this is now, we have an opportunity now to have federal support and collaboration and assistance. And so we're looking beyond just state solutions, because frankly, we're going to need them. So I'll stop there. Thank you for the opportunity to chat with this group. I'm really excited about the work you guys are doing.
Great, thank you. And next we have, well, we'll take another minute because Jamal Lewis would like to add something. Jamal, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, and I appreciate Sadie, as always. I think you do a really good job of articulating the nuance within the issue. I think it's also worth noting that, you know, the electrification is a really important means to achieving the goal. Another means is efficiency, and things like the weatherization assistance program is important in providing that service to LMI and disadvantaged communities. And one thing to note with that is that often the portions of the LMI community and disadvantaged communities aren't able to access those existing resources because of things that are preventing it, such as health and safety and other barriers. And so acknowledging the long-term disinvestment that has led to many of those issues is part of what we've discussed as well. And so addressing those items in concert, recognizing that, you know, at least 40% of the benefits have to accrue in disadvantaged communities. That is an additional benefit that we've discussed. And going back to thinking about, you know, what is, you know, what can be attractive about this type of transition. And one thing that we've received feedback on is the fact that, you know, the health benefits of these initiatives and these services and programs is something that provides or that generates excitement. And so, you know, that's something that we've touched on and that we've discussed in our group, but is definitely a difficult thing to tackle. And so we are open to other feedback and other guidance, but just to sort of round that out, I thought it was important to share that too.
Thanks, Jamal. I just want to add and the a 9-year-old, and the cause of her death was asthma. So they're calling carbon cause for her death. And that trigger of potential litigation could really open the doors to private capital addressing decarbonization of the built environment. And that's something else that we've thought about, the phase 1 approach to getting private capital to address, independent of any other subsidy, to drive scale in the built environment, which would bring down costs. So I just wanted, it popped up just now. I'll try to send it to the group, but I was fascinated by that. It's the first I've seen it.
Thank you, Sadie. I think we have next coming up agriculture and forestry with Julie Suarez. And thank you, Eddie. You reminded me that we missed our 5-minute break. So if you don't mind, if we can let Julie do her piece, and then we'll take a quick 5-minute break before we go into power gen. So Julie, do you want to take it over?
Thanks so much. Can you hear me okay, Rosa?
We got you.
Okay, excellent. I'm going to do the standard thing that most people seem to be doing when they're working from home. And I'm going to apologize for my dog, who is more than likely going to start barking in about 10 minutes when the mail carrier arrives. So I'm going to apologize in advance when you hear my dog. But really pleased to be able to give a quick update. Again, my name is Julie Suarez. I work for Cornell College of Ag and Life Sciences as Associate Dean, and really pleased and honored to have the opportunity to talk to you today. I'll just give you a couple brief updates from our committee, and I'll put my email in the chat. So if you have any questions afterwards that you want to connect with me, I'm always happy to link up afterwards. So our panel is the Ag and Forestry panel. We have 18 experts in the fields of agriculture and forestry. I do also want to give a special shout out to the diversity that's embodied on our committee. We have representatives not only from the urban forestry sector, but we also have farmers of color and land trusts who are institutions and organizations that are serving BIPOC farmers and beginning farmers as well. So I wanted to point that out. Our goals are a little bit different because in the agricultural sector, you know, we're really focused on trying to specifically address emissions of methane and nitrous oxide, particularly from livestock operations and cropland soil management. So we wanted to share that we've set an ambitious but achievable goal of by 2030 reducing current levels of methane and nitrous oxide emissions from, again, agricultural operations by 15%. We've set a goal of reaching a 30% reduction, again, specifically to methane and nitrous oxide emissions by 2050 by 30%. That's in line, that 30%, 50% reduction would take us back to, of course, getting back to from current levels or 1990 levels of emissions. And then we've also set a cross-sector goal to reduce fossil fuel use in the agriculture and forestry sectors in consultation with transportation and power generation advisory panels as well. You know, CO2 usage in vehicles is something that we're thinking about and exploring as a beneficial electrification strategy, but you know, we're not quite there yet for electrification of some of those heavy duty equipment that we use in the agricultural and forestry sector. So after forming kind of our goals and our plan to proceed, we've of course done what a lot of groups did and formed work groups because particularly in agriculture and forestry, there are so many different areas that we needed to tackle. We felt that that would be a good strategy for our particular group to do. So we formed a couple specific work groups, and within those teams right now, we're going through and trying to identify what are the adaptive management strategies we can use, both to mitigate and then also somewhat uniquely to really look at our working agricultural landscapes and working lands in our forests as a mechanism to better help the environment overall through carbon sequestration and storage strategies. So in other words, how do we not only mitigate our own emissions in these sectors, but how do we go several steps forward and really help all of us as a society move forward by enabling the better carbon storage and sequestration in our soils. So our work groups that we formed consist of livestock and dairy management. New York State has a really strong dairy community in New York. We're the third or fourth largest dairy producing state, very important industry, and where we know that we can develop good strategies to help mitigate methane and nitrous oxide emissions will be in the area of alternative manure management, including technologies like anaerobic digestion and potentially pyrolysis down the road, and also looking at more precision feed management and enteric fermentation strategies. That gets a little bit more into the weeds of things, but the more you pay attention to what a cow is actually eating, the better you're able to control emissions. Our next committee, which is a little bit less obscure perhaps and more what people hear about in the context of when people are talking about regenerative agriculture, which is we formed a subgroup on soil health and nutrient management. And so by nutrient management in this context, we're not talking about our cows so much as we're talking about fertilizer management and purchased inputs. We're also looking at soil carbon sequestration. What are the technologies and adaptive management strategies, again, that can help our farms and foresters more accurately predict and more accurately be able to adopt management practices which will sequester carbon, and thinking about developing soil quality standards or metrics for soil health. So we have a benchmarking tool for our farms and our foresters, and again, looking at new technologies and new concepts like biochar. Then we're also broke into an agroforestry subcommittee as well, where we're looking at technologies such as silvopasturing, which is the concept of grazing animals in forested areas. We're looking at alley cropping, again, where you're cropping in between planted trees. Of course, we're planting more trees and able to sequester carbon, and also looking as well at riparian forest buffers. And so there's some really fun work going on in this area. And our thinking is because so much of New York State's land is actually held by private sector entities, we need to make sure that we can develop economically beneficial strategies where people can manage their forests, manage their operations in such a way where the technologies and the strategies that they're using to sequester carbon, which benefits society, will also be economically viable for them. And agroforestry is one of those emerging areas where we think there's a great deal of potential in New York State. We're also looking at land conversions, of course, agricultural protection and access to farmland, keeping forests as forests, and of course, looking at utilizing our more marginal lands. New York State has a pretty good several million acres of lands which are
kind of engaged in what I would say kind of scrubwood land and looking at how we can utilize those marginal lands to better sequester carbon through afforestation and ensuring that that we're doing a better job in the land management arena. And then we also have a forestry subgroup. And here's where we're talking about urban forestry and things we can make sure that we do to help our built environment in New York City and other upstate cities maintain the benefits of trees. We're also looking at statewide afforestation and reforestation efforts. Again, I mentioned that a little bit previously as well. Looking at improved forest management, one of our significant challenges in the forestry sector is the regeneration pressures. Part of that is deer overbrowsing, and part of that is an influx of invasive species. And so how do we make sure that if our goal is to really start storing more carbon in trees and growing our forest sector, how do we make sure that we can actually naturally regenerate our woods, which is a pretty significant ecological problem we're facing in upstate New York. And we're also looking in the forestry sector for how do we increase the manufacture and use of harvested wood products. And then lastly, we have a whole separate subgroup headed by this that Marie Letty is kicking off from DEC. And this is the bioeconomy sector. And so looking at how do we enhance the markets for sustainably harvested and New York grown products that again will provide direct benefits in New York State, such as again, carbon sequestration, as well as indirect benefits through the substitution effect of utilizing bio-based products as a substitution for fossil fuel-based products. And so through it all, we're really trying to talk about, of course, as an academic institution, and SUNY ESF is also in this group. What are the R&D goals that we need to achieve to provide verification of strategies and technologies to store carbon so that when carbon markets are effectively developed, we can encourage a new way for farmers and foresters to receive some type of payment for the ecosystem benefits that they're providing to society at large. And so through this, we're really talking in some of the initial conversations we've been having about what's happening federally and the new direction of USDA, or at least the perceived new direction of USDA, will be very much in line at looking at conservation practices that farmers and foresters can do to store carbon. And so what do we need to do as a state to make sure that we're positioning our sectors in agriculture and forestry to really lead the way in utilizing some of what we perceive will be significant new programs from USDA to really tackle climate change. So I think that's really it for me, Rosa. Happy to take any questions. And again, I'll put my email in the chat. And there's a lot of good work going on in this group. I just kind of touched on a little bit of it, but more than happy to connect with you all.
Great, thank you, Julian. There were some comments from Jared in the chat, and we would definitely love to have your email so they can follow up. And I think, Eddie, you have a question.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, there's not nearly enough time for us to get into this deeply kind of complicated subject area. And for example, the environmental justice movement has a lot of concerns about carbon capture, use, and storage, which I won't go into right now. There's no time right now. But two quick questions. One is, the state organized a decarbonization workshop recently. And as part of that conversation, I remember one of the panelists suggesting that geologically speaking, carbon sequestration for New York State is not optimal. And I don't know if that has come up or if anyone from your working group saw that, and I wonder if there was any reaction to that statement. And secondly, the questions about biofuels. I'm just because I heard allusions to it in this report back, and I'm curious how your group is processing that when, in fact, there is no state life cycle assessment on biofuels, right? And the E3 Pathways report didn't even contemplate co-pollutants in the report. So there are knowledge gaps, huge gaps, and I'm just wondering how your working group is processing these gaps in knowledge.
Yeah, Eddie, you're asking really good questions, and I think I heard 3. So my sincere apologies if I miss 1 or 2, but again, I'd be more than happy to follow up with you after this too. So I think first you talked about carbon capture technologies, and I'm certainly aware and heard your really impactful comments earlier after Lara's report on the just transition about will carbon capture and storage technologies, particularly hydrogen, be located in areas, environmental justice areas? When I'm referring to carbon sequestration, I'm talking about more nature-based solutions. So not really schemes to kind of remove carbon using technology, but really I'll just share one really exciting new piece of work that was just released from one of our faculty members who's a plant scientist, which is looking at ways through plant breeding to improve plants' ability to photosynthesis and then increase their ability to store carbon in our soils through their root structure. So in other words, you'd be utilizing the natural ability of plants already to photosynthesis and to, obviously create nutrients for themselves and essentially sequester carbon in that way. Now that's like far out there technology, but that's just a quick example of when I'm referring to carbon sequestration in soils, I'm really talking about nature-based strategies, right? So cover cropping, no-till, utilizing some enhanced weatherization work, biochar. So I'd be happy to follow up with you and give you some better examples, but we're not talking about the displacement and the concern that you're mentioning, which is certainly a valid concern. So that was the first question. Now here's where I may get a little bit flustered. So I'm sorry, Eddie, if I've missed something. Please come back to me and at a later date and let me know. But I think I think I'm missing the second question in there. But the third question you asked was about biofuels. We have not had a really significant in-depth discussion about biofuels. We've been focusing more on bioeconomy in terms of the wood product sector. And so for that, we're looking at some interesting green building techniques. So how do we utilize wood as a substitute for building materials so that we're naturally using a product that we've grown, stored carbon in, harvested, and then actually turn it into a product that lasts for a longer life cycle. So biofuels have certainly been mentioned. I suspect that we will get into those discussions more, but they're not ones that our group has necessarily had as of yet. So I anticipate that those discussions will start coming in. I missed your second question, Eddie. I'm sorry. Simple-minded. I can only handle 2 questions at once.
No worries. In the short time I was trying to load up, but we'll follow up afterwards. But thank you, Julie. Appreciate it.
Happy to do so. Again, just send me an email. More than happy to chat.
Thank you, Julie. And I think now we'll get to my promised 5-minute break, and I'm going to hold you all to those 5 minutes because we do want to engage with the power generation and the other panels we have with us today. So 5 minutes, go. Hello, everyone. Hopefully you're all getting back from your 5-minute break. And yes, Eddie, I see your question about providing the report outs that the working group and the panels did to the Climate Action Council. And yes, we can get those report outs to you. Okay, great. So next up, we have the power generation panel, and I'm going to turn it over to Rory Christian from that panel. Rory?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for your time today. So I'm going to go over some of the topics that the Power Gen panel has dived into, and I'll start by addressing actually a question posed by Mr. Batista earlier regarding investigating new technologies. That comes in very well under the Power Gen panel's purview. Given where the state is targeting solar growth, 6 gigawatts in 2025, battery storage, 3 gigawatts by 2030, offshore wind, another 9 gigawatts by 2035, all in part of the goal of achieving 70% renewables by 2030. We're looking to examine what will be needed to get to the remaining, provide the remaining 30% of power needed to meet the state's needs. So we have had discussions regarding hydrogen. We've had discussions regarding long duration storage and other things that are going to be needed to fill that gap. And those have fit into some of the recommendations, which I'll talk about later today. I also wish to amplify what Ms. Skinner of the Just Transition Working Group said earlier by highlighting that we've also looked at the potential for career development, not just jobs in the energy sector, but also the development of careers and turning the opportunity to develop these power generation resources into long-term job opportunities that individuals can use to grow throughout the energy industry. So we've broken ourselves into 4 subgroups to better address specific topics. I'll start with the Solutions for the Future subgroup, which is focusing primarily on market solutions, understanding what solutions can be put together to attract and cause developers to bring into the state the right kind of technology to meet the yet unmet needs that New York still has to meet to be 100% emissions free. And that falls into the question of what kind of long duration storage technologies will be needed. There's some geographical and environmental considerations that need to be taken into account for those technologies. And these aren't simply the question of more lithium ion batteries or more battery storage. These are storage solutions that could potentially be active for days, if not weeks, in some situations, as the grid becomes more heavily reliant on renewables and those renewables are intermittent. During long periods of intermittency, we will need that storage or that energy delivery system that's emissions free to continue to provide us with power. So we're looking at market solutions that can help drive the development of those new things, and also how we can develop the technology through R&D to satisfy it and come up with new solutions. The barrier subgroup is focusing on clean energy siting and also energy delivery siting and host capacity. And these are important because we need to make sure that clean energy can be equitably distributed throughout the state, with emphasis on the need for downstate placement in many areas. We're also broken into a resource mix subgroup, which is primarily looking at how we're going to grow that renewable generation and energy efficiency needs, particularly in the as yet defined disadvantaged communities. We're also examining ways to transition from fossil fuel generation. And to answer Mr. Batista's earlier question, the hydrogen conversation has come in there, although we have no firm findings at the moment, but we will likely have a recommendation on what that could or may look like. And again, finally, we're also again focusing our attention here on the appropriate mix of energy storage and distributed energy resources to meet the needs towards 100% emissions free. And the final subgroup, the equity subgroup, is looking at the intersection of workforce development, which I mentioned earlier, community impact, and access and affordability for all. And for these topics, one of the things that we've identified as a crucial need is understanding what exactly will be meant by the term disadvantaged communities, what the definition will actually mean in the final version, and also what benefits, what will be defined as a benefit. So those conversations are ongoing and evolving, and we'll hopefully have more in the subsequent meetings to talk about in those areas. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Rory. I don't see anyone lined up in the chat. Are there questions or comments? Eddie, I saw your hand raised.
Hi, and Rory, I'm going to call you Mr. Christian because Bautista means Baptist, and with you being Christian and me being Baptist, people may get the wrong idea here, Rory. So good to see you, my brother. Quick question, and thanks so much for. I know you guys are. It's a lot of work, and appreciate all that you guys are doing. I'm just wondering, getting back for a second to the green hydrogen and the newer tech, there's a techno fetish that's been going on when it comes to clean energy that often feels to a lot of us like the last desperate attempt to hold on to fossil fuel infrastructure, and not to quote Malcolm, but by any means necessary. Like, I'm just wondering, as you guys are looking at some of these newer quote unquote clean technologies, are you also looking at it with an eye towards how much of this stuff is really dependent on maintaining natural gas, the blending of natural gas, and you know, the whole kind of worry about stranded assets that the fossil fuel industry is so concerned about?
Yeah, that's definitely part of the conversation, and that's actually explicitly why the hydrogen conversation has come up. I know I have participated in at least 3 separate discussions on hydrogen from different CEOs of different utilities, gas utilities, and hydrogen is often the thing that comes up as being a potential resource for maintaining the gas system to some degree in a 100% renewables or 100% clean energy future. I think, and we are not at the point yet where we can make this recommendation, but I think where we are is probably to call for the need of a study to look at the gas system, look at the potential for developing hydrogen resources and using that in the gas plants. That is likely a recommendation we may make, will make, but that's something we'd have to discuss as a group. So, but yeah, that's definitely something on our radar, and it's something we've been talking about at length.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions, working group members?
Yeah, I have a question. This is Jared Bly. Roy, thanks for the overview. I apologize if I didn't hear this, but I'm curious if the panel is looking at or exploring any options with like run-of-river hydro facilities or assets, and if there's any talk about investment in upgrades or bringing some of those back online. You know, specifically in the northern country, which is where I'm located at, we have a lot of those, and they're older, and I think there's some real opportunity that could be explored with those. I'm curious if the panel has discussed that at all.
We haven't discussed that specific application yet. I think the focus of our discussions, which line up with kind of how nice the New York ISO has been reporting the need in one of their more recent reports. When you look at the targets established by the state for battery storage, renewable energy, and whatnot, there's still an unmet need to reach that 100% net zero emissions. And the large majority of that need is downstate in zones J and zones K. In fact, more than half of the need is downstate. So much of our attention has been focusing on what could be done to bring more renewables, more emissions-free dispatchable generation capacity downstate, because as it is right now, I want to say 60, and hope someone from NISO can verify this number, 50, 60, if not 70% of the generation downstate is actually natural gas or oil mix in some way, shape, or form.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Great, thank you, Rory, for giving us that overview. I would like to turn now to the energy intensive and trade exposed industries panel. And we have Kevin Hansen with us today, along with other members of that panel. Kevin, would you take over?
Happy to, Rosa. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great, and thanks. I know we have really short time. Do we have a couple of slides for me or no?
I don't have them pulled up, but if you could give us an overview, I promise to share everything with the working group members. These are your slides from yesterday, right?
Yep, and I'm fine to go without. I just wanted to check. So first off, thanks everyone for the opportunity to share our panel's preliminary strategies and to collect your questions and feedback on our work so far, and obviously of how to think about issues of environmental justice, climate justice, as we go about our work. My name is Kevin Hansen, and I'm the head of public policy at Empire State Development. And I'm here today as a member of, and I'm with several of my colleagues from the EITE, as we call it, staff working group. So I promise I'll be very brief. I'm just going to take a few minutes with my introduction because I know how short our time is, and I want to make sure we receive as much of your feedback as possible. So for context, the scope of the energy intensive and trade exposed industries advisory panel is really to develop strategies to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions from industrial activities. And we're also working closely with the Just Transition Working Group's business impact subgroup, which you heard a little bit about a short while ago. And that relates not just to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but also figuring out how to support energy intensive and trade exposed industries and workers, and identifying other issues and opportunities that are going to arise from the state's transition to a clean energy economy. So as we have gone about our work, before we get into the strategies, I think it's helpful to share just a few of the key considerations that have guided that work. First, obviously, we have an overarching need to consider a lot of the elements raised in the climate legislation that created this process, the CLCPA, things like environmental justice, disadvantaged communities, and a just transition. And that obviously permeates everything we do. So that I think is a big overarching consideration. And then we've also got some more panel specific things that are guiding our work. The first is that industries within our scope represent about 7% of current state greenhouse gas emissions. These emissions come from manufacturing, mining, and construction sectors. And they generally come from three sources. The largest source, we believe, is from on-site fuel combustion, so burning fossil fuels, for heat, for some kind of heat treatment process. The second highest share comes from indirect emissions based on the use of electricity. And what we believe the smallest share comes from non-combustion industrial processes like chemical reactions associated with the production of something like cement, where greenhouse gases are ultimately produced, but it's not necessarily burning. So the first consideration just relates to where these emissions are coming from and their overall size and the scale of the economy. Secondly, I think industrial emission sources we've heard are very diverse. They're not homogeneous across industries and facilities. And so in many cases, they're likely to require, plant-specific, industry-specific, customized solutions, as opposed to, larger scale solutions such as a large renewable energy project. Third, most of the emissions within our scope come from industries that are considered energy intensive and trade exposed. So we've emphasized incentive-oriented approaches to make sure we're mitigating the potential for driving those activities out of the state and resulting in emissions leakage, as well as obviously potential job losses. And then lastly, the points raised earlier, we've talked a lot about kind of technologies and new stuff that's out there and how mature is it. I think so far what we've seen in our sector is that the greatest near-term opportunities are likely to be from energy efficiency and also the electrification of certain industrial processes, especially some of those low heat processes. High heat processes are harder to electrify. But a lot of deeper decarbonization is expected to require a lot of innovation over the longer term. And so we had some very initial presentations on, hydrogen and carbon capture and storage, but really just as a summary of the deep decarbonization webinar that was held and kind of getting us started down the path of looking at what else is out there down the road. So with those in mind, we looked at the efforts of other jurisdictions and we identified a half dozen strategies to mitigate industrial emissions. The first was providing financial incentives and technical assistance to help industries decarbonize. The second was creating incentives or preferential standards for the state to buy more low carbon products, which both reduces the environmental impact of the state while also creating new markets and helping the state to become a leader as some of these companies were able to offer more green products. Third was to identify and support technological innovations that could enable deeper industry decarbonization. So this gets to the point that there are still technology gaps and trying to understand where those gaps are and supporting things like R&D investments and demonstration and pilot projects to help prove technologies. Fourth was to support workforce training so that we have a workforce that can implement these energy efficiency and decarbonization measures as well as seize opportunities in the new economy. Fifth, we have a strategy of collecting more data on industrial greenhouse gas emissions to prioritize the state's emission reduction efforts and monitor our progress. At this point in time, not all facilities that produce a material amount of greenhouse gas emissions are required to report to the state. Even though many of those we think are required to report on the same topic to the EPA. So while we're very sensitive to, imposing, undue administrative burdens on companies, we're also trying to find ways to give the state more intelligence about where its emissions are coming from within industry in ways that we think are manageable. And lastly, this isn't as much about emission reductions, but we've also talked about providing economic incentives to help grow the green economy. The state already has a number of programs like NISTAR, which funds technology centers that help commercialize new products. And several centers are in the field of clean energy and kind of in this space. We also have New York Ventures, a state-administered venture capital fund that has invested in a number of green economy companies that also produce, positive environmental impacts through their products. And in addition to those, we have more traditional economic incentives in terms of tax credits and things in exchange for the commitments of jobs and private investment. And those have really prioritized green economy companies as well. And in addition to the economic benefits, obviously creating those opportunities for workers, building an in-state supply chain of green economy companies is something that we think will also help the state achieve its climate goals. So we really hope to get some great ideas from this group on how to fully incorporate, some of these equity considerations into our panel more. But a few things that we've identified so far, and you may have seen yesterday if you saw our report out to the Climate Action Council, include things like considering whether a project would be in a disadvantaged community when making program awards for financial or technical assistance. As I'm sure many of you are very familiar with the goal of 40% of the benefits of certain spending going to disadvantaged communities. We've also talked about performing targeted outreach to industrial facilities in disadvantaged communities to try to make sure that those in particular are aware of and get assistance with emission reduction programs. And finally, we think workforce development is going to be a big piece of this, obviously, and making sure that we're developing workforces in disadvantaged communities and supporting other types of disadvantaged individuals, including state-certified minority and women-owned business enterprises. So that's a quick summary of our strategies so far. And with that said, we're now happy to take any questions and hear your suggestions. So thanks.
Great, thank you, Kevin. And we have a question in the chat from Rawa. Eddie, I hope you don't mind if I read that one first.
Please.
She'd like to know, has there been any thought to creating opportunities for people who are traditionally not in these industries to participate, for example, BIPOC and women, not just workforce, but in business development and supply chain?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think, the Empire State Development administers the state's Minority and Women-Owned Business Enterprise Program. And, that program has traditionally been focused more on ensuring that there aren't disparities in the awards of state contracts. But we also, I think, partner and support our MWBEs in a lot of other ways. We have, financial assistance programs that I think often help a lot of MWBEs. And so, I think in particular, small businesses that are owned by minorities and women would absolutely be a focus on as part of our workforce effort. And, another thing, you talked about not traditionally being in the industry. You don't necessarily have to be, you don't have to go to college for green economy to get a job in the clean energy economy. If you're a certain type of electrician, maybe you can work on an offshore wind project. If you're a truck driver, you can haul a lot of these products. So we think there are going to be a lot of positive economic opportunities for people in some of these legacy industries as well, and want to make sure, again, that we're doing everything we can to extend those opportunities to a diverse array of groups and not just one. So good comment.
Thanks. And Eddie, your question or comment?
Yeah, thanks. Kevin, can you share what NYSERDA's position or perspective is on hydrogen as a fuel combustion source, which is how we hear it being possibly considered as a green hydrogen technology? But what's NYSERDA's position or perspective on hydrogen as a fuel combustion source, given the recorded high emission rates of NOx?
Yeah, I'll hesitate to speak for NYSERDA. Somebody else can chime in if they have something to add on this point. But, I would put it, at least so far in the context of how it's presented to our panel, in the bucket of, technologies and process solutions for reducing emissions that are perhaps a little farther out in terms of being, viable for mainstream adoption. I mean, your point about, the release of other gases, I think as it was raised on this panel, that's an important part of the conversation. And I think, I'm sure that will be going forward. But anyone on the NYSERDA team want to say anything else on this point?
Hey, Kevin, can you hear me? This is Todd Baldigo from NYSERDA.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yep, we hear you.
Yeah. Just to Eddie, thank you for the question. If obviously falls under the pillar of the deep decarbonization for low carbon fuels that needs to be considered and discussed further, especially when it comes to processes in the industrial manufacturing space where high temperature is needed. What are those solutions to switch off of fossil fuels to other, potentially, green solutions? And that discussion needs to, happen, in more in depth within the panel. And as Kevin pointed out, this is a pillar of more longer term impacts to get to what E3 pathways pointed to of 80% reduction by 2050.
Great, thank you, Todd. And I know we're over, but if you have time to answer one last question, it's coming from Sonal. Has there been discussion about checks and monitoring of foul play for these industries and businesses?
Sure. If you're referring to foul play as, I guess, greenhouse gas emissions or the emission of other gases or substances, I think maybe if my colleague Chris Lalone, it looks like he's still on, could maybe just talk a little bit about the type of emission reporting that happens today and the way I think that you in some cases use monitors and in other cases use self-reporting and anything that might address that question. And if that wasn't the question, please feel free to elaborate on that question.
Yeah, Kevin. Yeah, I don't know that we've directly talked about, the potential for foul play. Obviously, being with DEC for a number of years and working in air pollution, there's always the potential for foul play. And you know, with every regulation, we try to put in checks and balances and reporting requirements and ways for us to verify emissions. Currently, we, you know, all of our Title V facilities report on all their criteria pollutants, hazardous air pollutants, as well as greenhouse gas emissions. So, you know, that system's been in place for over 20 years now. And I think, you know, it's rather well established, and it's something that we can easily verify emissions. You know, going forward with greenhouse gases, where maybe we're looking at some industries we haven't in the past, you know, it's something that we need to certainly keep in mind and have methods in place to ensure that we have good enforcement.
Great, thank you, Chris, and thank you everyone from your panel for joining. I'm going to try to wrap us up very quickly. You saw that I tried to squeeze in the waste panel for today. This is a newly formed panel, so not as far along in their work as others, and we'll definitely be following up to have that engagement with them and this working group. Just a quick recap of today and our follow-up points. I'm going to be sending out the minutes, and if everyone can please send your responses to the polling for the January meetings. We also shared the link for the slides from the Climate Action Council report outs, but we'll follow up by email as well. And finally, we'll be following up with the draft evaluation rubric and our next steps with that rubric. Thank you everyone for participating and staying on a little longer. And we hope you have a great and restful holiday, and take care. Thank you all.
Thank you.